Consider for a moment the strange intersection between quantum mechanics and human consciousness, where a thought experiment emerges that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about death and existence itself. Quantum immortality proposes that from the subjective perspective of any conscious observer, that observer can never experience their own death, because consciousness itself may be inherently linked to the wave function collapse that defines quantum reality. Imagine yourself in a thought experiment known as the quantum suicide scenario, where you sit before a device that measures the spin of a quantum particle, and depending on the result, either does nothing or triggers a fatal outcome with equal probability. According to standard quantum mechanics, before observation, the particle exists in a superposition of both states simultaneously. However, from your personal perspective as the conscious observer, the theory suggests that your consciousness would always find itself in the branch of reality where you survived, because a dead observer cannot experience their own non-existence. You would continue forward through increasingly improbable timelines, experiencing ever more unlikely near-death encounters and miraculous survivals, all while remaining subjectively aware of your continued existence. The mechanism underlying this unsettling idea rests on the interpretation of quantum mechanics known as the many worlds interpretation, which posits that every quantum event causes the universe to split into multiple branches, each representing a different possible outcome, all of which are equally real. When combined with the Anthropic Principle, which suggests that the universe must be compatible with conscious observation, quantum immortality creates a paradoxical framework where consciousness becomes a kind of filter that guarantees its own persistence through increasingly bizarre and improbable circumstances. Yet despite the mathematical elegance and philosophical intrigue of this concept, we continue to live our lives and accept death as inevitable, never truly grappling with the implication that perhaps our consciousness perpetually escapes it through endless branching realities we cannot perceive. The theory remains largely ignored by mainstream science and philosophy, treated more as a thought experiment than a serious contender for understanding reality, even as its logical structure remains fundamentally difficult to refute or completely dismiss without addressing deeper questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is that we cannot know whether we are currently experiencing quantum immortality, trapped in an increasingly improbable succession of survivals, our aging bodies and failing health merely the subjective markers of an observer moving through ever narrower branches of reality. This possibility transforms the very act of continued existence into an ambiguous phenomenon. Are we living longer because we are fortunate, or are we merely conscious observers following the only trajectory through spacetime where consciousness persists? If this hypothesis holds any truth, then every person who has ever narrowly escaped death, the accident avoided by seconds, the illness that defied medical prediction, the catastrophe that never quite materialized, might be collecting evidence of their own quantum immortality, each survival a breadcrumb trail through branching realities where other versions of themselves did not prove so fortunate. The implications are simultaneously comforting and profoundly isolating. We may be immortal, but only to ourselves. In this solipsistic framework, the universe becomes a deeply personal construct, collapsing toward whatever outcome preserves the observer's subjective experience, meaning that your improbable survival might appear as miracle to others while remaining inevitable necessity to you. Imagine standing at a crossroads in your life, faced with a decision that will fundamentally alter the trajectory of everything that follows, and consider for a moment that every possible choice you could make actually does happen, not in some distant metaphorical sense, but literally, simultaneously, in branches of reality that exist as concretely as the one you currently inhabit. This is the essence of the many worlds interpretation, a theoretical framework that emerged from the mind of physicist Hugh Everett in 1956 as he grappled with one of the deepest paradoxes in quantum mechanics, the question of what happens when we observe a quantum system and force it to collapse into a single state. The interpretation proposes that rather than reality selecting one outcome and discarding all others as mere unrealized possibilities, the universe actually branches into multiple distinct realities at every quantum event, with each possible outcome occurring in its own separate branch, creating an infinitely branching tree of parallel universes where every version of every possibility exists in equal measure. When you make a decision to accept a job offer in a distant city, The many worlds framework suggests that you simultaneously accept it in one branch of reality while declining it in another, with both versions of you living out the full consequences of those choices in their respective universes, never aware of or able to interact with the alternate paths that could have been taken. The psychological mechanism that allows this theory to persist and gain credence among serious physicists, despite its almost incomprehensible implications, lies in its elegant mathematical consistency and its ability to eliminate certain problematic aspects of other interpretations of quantum mechanics, particularly the need for conscious observation to collapse the wave function into reality. A notion that troubled many scientists who found it philosophically unpalatable and too dependent on human perception. The many worlds interpretation accomplishes this by suggesting that observation does not collapse the wave function at all, but rather causes the observer to become entangled with the system, splitting the observer themselves into multiple versions, each of whom experiences one of the possible outcomes, thus preserving the mathematical integrity of quantum mechanics while avoiding the troubling implications of a universe that somehow privileges human consciousness or requires external observers to create reality. What makes this interpretation remarkable is how we have gradually normalized the existence of this theory despite its staggering implications for our understanding of identity, choice, and the nature of reality itself, discussing it in academic circles and popular science media with an almost clinical detachment. As though the existence of countless parallel versions of ourselves making every possible choice is merely an interesting mathematical curiosity rather than a profound statement about the structure of existence that challenges our deepest intuitions about responsibility, meaning, and the uniqueness of our own experiences and decisions. Yet perhaps this clinical acceptance itself reveals something profound about human cognition, our capacity to intellectually embrace ideas that fundamentally contradict our lived experience, to understand that in some mathematical sense, a version of us rejected this very task while another accepted it, and still proceed through our days guided by the conviction that our choices matter in ways that transcend the branching infinities of theoretical physics. This paradox that we can simultaneously accept the mathematical reality of infinite branches while rejecting its existential implications may itself be the most interesting quantum phenomenon of all, a collapse of sorts that occurs not in the external universe, but within the architecture of human meaning-making, where we choose, perhaps necessarily, to live as if our choices matter absolutely, even while acknowledging they may matter not at all. Imagine standing in your bedroom at this very moment, making a decision about whether to continue listening to this narration or to turn it off and drift towards sleep. And in another corner of existence, a version of you has already made the opposite choice, creating a branching reality where that alternate decision unfolds with all its consequences cascading forward into an entirely separate timeline. This is the essence of multiverse theory, a framework that suggests our universe is not singular and isolated, but rather one among potentially infinite parallel universes, each containing variations of reality shaped by different quantum outcomes, different initial conditions, and different choices made by conscious and unconscious entities throughout existence. The concept emerges not from philosophy alone, but from legitimate physics, particularly from interpretations of quantum mechanics that grapple with the perplexing nature of probability and observation, where subatomic particles exist in superposition until measured, suggesting that perhaps every possible outcome of every quantum event actually occurs, just in separate branches of reality that never interact with our own. When physicists contemplate the double-slit experiment or the wave-particle duality of light, they confront a mathematical truth that defies intuitive understanding, and some propose that the many worlds interpretation provides the most straightforward explanation. Rather than a particle mysteriously choosing which slit to pass through or collapsing into one state upon observation, it simply exists in all possible states across multiple universes simultaneously. The psychological mechanism beneath our fascination with multiverse theory operates on a profound level, touching upon our deepest anxieties about choice, consequence, and the roads not taken in our own lives. We are creatures haunted by counterfactual thinking, endlessly wondering what would have happened had we chosen differently, spoken differently, moved differently through critical moments. And multiverse theory offers a strange comfort by suggesting that somewhere, in some branch of reality, every possible version of every possible choice is already happening, has already happened, will always be happening. This creates a peculiar form of existential relief, transforming our regrets and doubts into merely provincial concerns about which branch of infinite branches we happen to occupy, reducing the weight of personal responsibility even as it multiplies the copies of ourselves experiencing every conceivable outcome. What makes multiverse theory remarkable in its persistence is that despite its profound implications and its apparent lack of testability, it has become increasingly mainstream in scientific discourse, taught in universities, discussed in peer-reviewed journals, and treated with the kind of provisional acceptance usually reserved for more empirically grounded frameworks. The theory normalizes itself through language and mathematical elegance, presented as a logical consequence of taking quantum mechanics seriously rather than as speculative metaphysics, and this linguistic framing shifts it from the realm of imagination into the domain of rigorous science, even though we possess no experimental evidence of parallel universes and no conceivable method of detecting them. We have collectively agreed to treat mathematics as evidence in itself, allowing abstract calculations and theoretical consistency to substitute for direct observation. And this agreement reflects a broader transformation in how modern science understands reality itself. Where once we demanded that theories explain only what we could measure and touch, we now accept that the universe might operate according to principles fundamentally beyond our observational reach, and multiverse theory represents the apotheosis of this shift, a framework so intellectually satisfying that its unfalsifiability becomes almost irrelevant. A kind of scientific poetry that we have tacitly agreed to fund and study, as if it were empirical fact rather than elaborate speculation dressed in the language of mathematics. Imagine a scenario in which a person places themselves in front of a device that operates according to the principles of quantum mechanics, a theoretical construct where a subatomic particle exists in a superposition of states until the moment it is observed or measured, at which point the wave function collapses into a single definite outcome. And in this thought experiment, the device is programmed such that if the particle is measured in one state, a lethal mechanism is triggered. Yet if measured in the opposite state, the person emerges completely unharmed, and crucially, they have no way of knowing which outcome has occurred except by surviving to witness it themselves. This is the essence of quantum suicide, a philosophical paradox that emerges from the intersection of quantum mechanics and the many worlds interpretation, where the universe supposedly branches into multiple parallel realities each time a quantum event occurs. And in this framework, from the subjective perspective of the person undergoing this experiment, they would always find themselves in the branch of reality where they survived. Because the branches where they die would contain no conscious observer to experience that outcome. The mechanism underlying this troubling concept relies on a particular interpretation of how quantum mechanics actually functions, specifically the many worlds interpretation proposed by Hugh Everett in 1957, which suggests that every quantum possibility actualizes in some parallel universe. And that consciousness or observation does not truly collapse the wave function, but rather causes the observer to become entangled with the outcome and experience only the branch consistent with their continued existence, meaning that no matter how many times the device is activated, the surviving observer would theoretically always experience survival, as if guided by an invisible hand toward the only futures in which they remain conscious. What makes this paradox so conceptually persistent despite its obvious logical problems is that it forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, probability, and whether our subjective experience of reality might be shaped by selection effects we do not fully understand. And even though quantum suicide has no practical application and remains purely theoretical, even though physicists widely reject it as a misapplication of quantum mechanics to macroscopic objects and human consciousness, even though it contradicts our understanding of how observation and decoherence actually function in quantum systems, the idea continues to circulate through popular culture and online communities, suggesting something deeper in human nature yearns to believe that consciousness itself might possess some special relationship to physical reality. That perhaps our awareness operates under rules fundamentally different from mere matter, and that survival against overwhelming odds might reflect something more than simple luck or probability, a deeply human desire to locate ourselves at the center of physical law rather than accept ourselves as incidental observers in an indifferent cosmos. Yet this yearning also reveals how readily we misuse the tools of science to comfort ourselves, transforming rigorous mathematical frameworks into narratives of cosmic favoritism. And in doing so, we transform quantum mechanics from a description of how particles behave into a metaphysical guarantor of our own importance. The irony is particularly sharp when we consider that quantum suicide, despite its name, offers no actual escape from mortality. It merely relocates death into parallel branches we cannot access, transforming the problem of human finitude into a problem of perspective rather than solving it, and in this way, the thought experiment becomes less a scientific proposition and more a mirror reflecting our desperate hope that consciousness might somehow transcend the very physical laws we claim to study. Imagine waking up one morning with the peculiar realization that everything surrounding you, from the coffee cup on your nightstand to the vast expanse of stars visible through your window on a clear evening, might not be fundamentally real in the way you have always assumed. This is the central premise of the simulation hypothesis, a philosophical proposition that has gained considerable traction in contemporary thought, particularly among physicists, philosophers, and technologists who wonder whether our universe and our lives within it might be an elaborate computational construction rather than a base reality. The hypothesis suggests that we are not living in an original universe, but rather within a highly sophisticated simulation created by an advanced civilization, much like how we ourselves create video games or virtual environments in our own technological present. When we examine this idea carefully, we find ourselves considering the possibility that the laws of physics we have discovered, the mathematical principles that govern everything from quantum mechanics to gravitational fields, might be the underlying code of this immense simulation, running on incomprehensibly powerful computers or systems of computation that exist at some higher level of reality we cannot directly perceive or access. The mechanism by which this hypothesis captures our imagination rests upon several logical considerations that have motivated serious academic discussion. First, there exists the argument that if civilizations can advance technologically to a sufficiently high degree, they would eventually possess the capability to create simulations of reality that are indistinguishable from genuine reality, complete with conscious beings capable of awareness and sensation. Second, if such advanced civilizations create multiple simulations, then statistically speaking, there would be far more conscious entities existing within simulations than in any base reality, suggesting that we are more likely to be simulated than authentic. This is sometimes called the trilemma of Nick Bostrom, which presents three possibilities. Either civilizations inevitably destroy themselves before reaching simulation capability, they choose not to create such simulations, or we are almost certainly living within one already. Yet despite the logical coherence of this argument, we continue to navigate our daily lives without genuinely wrestling with the implications, accepting instead the pragmatic framework that our reality functions according to consistent rules, whether it is simulated or not. We have essentially normalized the uncertainty, recognizing that if we are indeed within a simulation, it operates so seamlessly and consistently that distinguishing it from base reality becomes philosophically irrelevant to our moment-to-moment experience and survival. The simulation hypothesis persists in our collective consciousness not because it provides answers, but because it raises questions that resonate with something fundamental in human nature, touching upon our eternal wonder about the nature of existence itself and our place within the cosmos. Perhaps it is this very capacity to contemplate our own potential artificiality, to question the nature of reality itself, that distinguishes conscious beings, whether simulated or otherwise, as entities capable of profound self-reflection and existential inquiry. In this sense, the simulation hypothesis becomes less a claim about objective reality and more a mirror reflecting our deepest philosophical concerns, the nature of consciousness, the origins of existence, and whether meaning can exist independent of a creator's intent. Whether we inhabit base reality or an elaborate simulation, the pursuit of understanding itself remains the most authentically human endeavor we possess. In the vast expanse of theoretical physics, there exists a thought experiment so unsettling that it challenges the very foundation of our understanding of consciousness, existence, and the nature of reality itself. This phenomenon is known as Boltzmann Brains, named after the 19th-century Austrian physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, who first grappled with questions about entropy and the arrow of time. The Boltzmann brain concept emerges from a deceptively simple observation about probability and thermodynamics, yet it spirals into philosophical depths that leave us questioning whether we ourselves might be nothing more than temporary fluctuations in an infinite void. Imagine, if you will, an eternal universe stretching infinitely backward and forward through time, governed entirely by the laws of physics and probability. Within such a cosmos, given sufficient time, absolutely anything that is physically possible will eventually occur by pure chance. The atoms and particles that compose the universe could, through an incomprehensibly unlikely but mathematically possible arrangement, spontaneously assemble themselves into a fully formed conscious brain, complete with sensory organs, a body, and even false memories of a lifetime never lived. This is the Boltzmann brain. The mechanism underlying this troubling concept rests upon the second law of thermodynamics and the principle of statistical mechanics. In any closed system given infinite time, disorder will naturally increase, but occasionally, through sheer random chance, brief pockets of order will spontaneously emerge from chaos before dissolving back into entropy. Just as a shuffled deck of cards might, by pure accident, fall into perfect suit and sequence order, so too could the particles of the universe arrange themselves into conscious beings experiencing vivid subjective worlds, only to dissipate moments later. The mathematical probability of such an event is vanishingly small, yet divided into the infinity of time and space, it becomes not merely possible but inevitable. What makes this concept so philosophically disturbing is that if such random Boltzmann brains are indeed possible, then in an infinitely old universe, they would vastly outnumber beings like ourselves who evolved through natural processes within galaxies and planetary systems. This creates what physicists call the Boltzmann brain problem. If we accept the premises of an eternal universe governed by probability, then it becomes statistically far more likely that we ourselves are such random fluctuations experiencing temporary delusions of continuity and causality rather than genuine evolved beings in a coherent cosmos. We persist in our comfortable understanding that we are products of evolution, that our memories reflect actual events, and that the universe behaves according to consistent physical laws, yet this framework collapses under the weight of infinite time and infinite probability. The thought experiment remains unresolved in theoretical physics, with some scientists proposing new cosmological models to escape its implications, others suggesting that the universe might not be eternal or infinite after all, and still others accepting the unsettling conclusion that we cannot truly know whether our existence is real or merely a brief hallucination sparked by randomly assembled atoms. Despite having no logical resolution, and despite the profound uncertainty it introduces into our understanding of reality, the Boltzmann brain paradox persists as a serious consideration in contemporary cosmology and philosophy of mind. We continue to live our lives with the assumption of genuine continuity and authentic causality, not because we have solved this puzzle, but because we have learned to exist comfortably within the uncertainty, accepting that profound questions about the nature of our own consciousness may forever remain suspended between the possible and the unknowable, between the real and the random. Imagine millions of people across the globe sharing the exact same false memory of an event that never happened in the way they remember it. A collective misremembering so widespread and consistent that it begins to feel less like individual forgetfulness and more like a shared alternate reality, and this phenomenon has come to be known as the Mandela Effect. Named after the widespread false memory that Nelson Mandela died in prison during the 1980s, when in fact he was released and went on to become president of South Africa, passing away in 2013, yet countless individuals report with absolute certainty that they remember watching his funeral on television and reading about his death decades earlier. The effect extends far beyond this singular case into a vast landscape of collective misrememberings that touch nearly every aspect of popular culture and our shared consciousness, with people insisting that the Berenstain Bears was actually spelled Berenstein, that the cornucopia appears in the fruit of the Loom logo when it decidedly does not, that C-3PO has a silver leg rather than both golden legs, that chartreuse is more red than yellow despite being predominantly yellow, and that there was a genie character in Aladdin called Genie who granted wishes when the actual Disney film features no such character. Each of these false memories held with such conviction and commonality that those who possess them feel certain they must be right and question whether they have somehow slipped into an alternate timeline where things unfolded differently. The psychological mechanisms driving the Mandela Effect operate through the natural vulnerabilities and shortcuts of human memory, which is not a perfect recording device, but rather a reconstructive system that fills in gaps with logic and expectation, blending real information with assumptions and patterns our brains have learned from experience, and when multiple people encounter the same misleading cue or shared cultural reference. They may all reconstruct the same false memory in identical ways, creating a chorus of identical misrememberings that feels almost impossible to attribute to mere coincidence. Our brains are extraordinarily good at pattern recognition and prediction, so when we see a logo with symmetrical elements or a brand name that follows predictable linguistic patterns, our minds sometimes provide what should logically be there rather than what actually is there. And when we discuss these false memories with others who share them, we reinforce these neural pathways through a process called confabulation, where we unconsciously fill in details and solidify the false memory further with each retelling. What makes the Mandela Effect particularly fascinating and somewhat unsettling is how it persists even when confronted with clear evidence to the contrary, as people often respond to photographic proof or archival evidence by suggesting they have somehow shifted into a different reality or that the evidence itself has been altered to match this new timeline. And rather than updating their memory to match the actual facts, many individuals double down on their false recollection, creating elaborate explanations involving parallel universes and dimensional shifts to account for the discrepancy between what they remember and what objectively exists. And this phenomenon reveals something profound about the nature of shared reality and consensus, suggesting that our collective sense of what actually happened is far more fragile and malleable than we typically acknowledge, and that the stories we tell ourselves about the past, repeated and reinforced through social media and collective discussion, can become more real to us than objective fact itself. Consider the persistent human experience of standing in a moment and feeling with absolute certainty that you have lived this exact sequence of events before, or conversely, that you are witnessing a version of your life that diverged from another path you nearly took. These are not memories in the traditional sense, yet they possess a quality of recognition that feels simultaneously alien and intimately familiar, as though you are observing your own existence from a point somewhere outside of linear time. The real-life situation manifests most vividly in moments of profound decision-making, where individuals report experiencing a strange dual awareness of having chosen differently in some other branch of reality, or in those uncanny instances where a person encounters someone they feel certain they once knew in an entirely different context or timeline, only to discover no record of such an encounter ever occurring. Some describe it as a fragmentation of conscious experience, where the person seems to split into multiple versions momentarily, each aware of slightly different outcomes, slightly different choices, slightly different loves and losses. The psychological mechanism that undergirds this phenomenon appears rooted in the human brain's remarkable capacity for counterfactual thinking and predictive simulation, wherein the mind constantly generates alternative scenarios of what could have happened or might still happen, creating a kind of internal branching structure of possibilities that can occasionally blade into conscious awareness. This ability to imagine ourselves in different circumstances, to model alternate outcomes with such vividness that they feel experiential rather than merely imagined, may occasionally collapse the distinction between what we simulated and what we believe we actually lived. Furthermore, the concept of alternate timelines aligns with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, where the many worlds interpretation suggests that every quantum event spawns diverging realities, and while these branches exist entirely beyond our perception, the human consciousness may possess some subtle sensitivity to the probability waves of unchosen paths. The persistence of this experience, despite its apparent illogicality, speaks to something profound about how we have normalized the coexistence of actual and potential selves within our everyday understanding of identity, accepting without much resistance the idea that somewhere in the depths of our being, we are simultaneously living out the consequences of all the choices we did not make. Perhaps this is why we grieve not only the lives we have lost, but also the versions of ourselves we will never become, a mourning that extends across timelines we never consciously inhabited, yet somehow feel we have abandoned. In this way, the experience of alternate timelines becomes less a glitch in perception and more a recognition that the self is fundamentally plural existing not as a single continuous thread, but as a shimmering bundle of all the people we might have been, each one equally real in the architecture of our consciousness. And perhaps this is why certain moments, a song that triggers inexplicable nostalgia, a stranger's face that seems to know us, a choice we almost made but didn't, carry such disproportionate emotional weight. They are the echoes of those unchosen selves pressing against the membrane of our lived reality, reminding us that every version of ourselves exists somewhere in the landscape of possibility, mourning and celebrating in parallel. In this sense, the déjà vu that visits us unbidden may not be a malfunction of memory at all, but rather a moment when the boundaries between timelines grow thin enough that we briefly perceive the echo of a choice made elsewhere. A path walked by another version of ourselves whose experience bleeds momentarily into our own consciousness, leaving us with the haunting certainty that we have always been infinite. Across cultures spanning thousands of years and encompassing billions of people, the concept of reincarnation persists as one of humanity's most enduring metaphysical beliefs, suggesting that consciousness, or the soul, returns to inhabit new bodies after death, cycling through multiple lives in a continuous journey of spiritual progression or karmic consequence. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, reincarnation forms the foundational framework through which suffering and existence itself are understood, with the belief that one's actions in a previous life directly determine the circumstances of the current incarnation, creating a comprehensive moral cosmology where justice operates not within a single lifetime, but across an infinite series of them. Contemporary accounts regularly surface of individuals, particularly young children who spontaneously recall vivid details about past lives they claim to have lived, describing specific names of people they knew, architectural features of houses they inhabited, or the precise circumstances of their previous deaths, often with remarkable accuracy that seems to exceed what chance coincidence could reasonably account for. Parents and researchers document these cases with careful attention, noting how children sometimes display inexplicable skills or phobias aligned with their purported past life narratives, such as a young child demonstrating advanced knowledge of a language never taught to them or exhibiting intense fear of the exact method by which they claim to have previously died. The psychological mechanism underlying reincarnation belief operates through several interconnected pathways, beginning with our fundamental human resistance to accepting the permanence of death and the annihilation of identity, as consciousness experiences itself as continuous and unbroken within a single lifetime, making it intuitively difficult to accept that this stream of awareness simply ceases utterly when the body fails. Memory itself becomes the psychological anchor for these beliefs, as the human mind naturally constructs narratives of identity across time, linking past experiences to present selfhood through continuous recollection, which then projects this same continuity backward through death, suggesting that if consciousness persists as a unified entity, it must have persisted before as well. The apparent accuracy of some past life recollections can be explained through multiple overlapping cognitive phenomena, including false memory construction, where the mind seamlessly incorporates details from overheard conversations, books, films, or photographs into what feels like direct personal recall, combined with pattern recognition systems that detect meaningful connections between random details and construct coherent narratives retroactively. Confirmation bias profoundly shapes these experiences, as people actively seek and emphasize details that seem to confirm past life narratives while unconsciously filtering out or reinterpreting contradictory evidence, a tendency amplified when social groups and belief communities reinforce these interpretations through shared discourse and collective validation. What remains remarkable is not necessarily the individual cases of claimed past life recall, which can be adequately explained through ordinary psychological mechanisms, but rather the institutional persistence and social normalization of reincarnation belief, despite the complete absence of any empirical mechanism through which consciousness could be stored, transmitted, and reinstantiated in a new biological substrate. Yet billions of people hold these beliefs as deeply true, having constructed entire moral and philosophical systems upon them, suggesting that the human need for continuity, meaning, and moral justice operating across time exceeds our commitment to demanding empirical evidence for the mechanisms that would make such beliefs possible. Throughout human history, there exists a persistent phenomenon where individuals encounter someone who appears to be their exact physical double, a stranger who shares their face, their build, their mannerisms, and sometimes even their voice, creating an uncanny mirror of self that exists entirely outside their own body and consciousness. These encounters, known as doppelgängers, have been documented across cultures and centuries, from ancient folklore to contemporary social media accounts, where photographs of supposed lookalikes accumulate with remarkable frequency, suggesting that somewhere in the world there exists another version of ourselves living a completely parallel and independent life. The accounts vary widely in their specificity. Some individuals report seeing their doppelganger briefly on a street corner before the figure vanishes into a crowd, never to be found again despite extensive searching. Others describe receiving photographs from strangers who claim to have encountered a person identical to them in distant countries they have never visited. Still others tell stories of being mistaken for someone else repeatedly over years, suggesting a persistent double living nearby and conducting their own separate existence. The psychological mechanism underlying our receptiveness to doppelganger narratives lies in the human brain's remarkable capacity for pattern recognition and the cognitive phenomenon known as pareidolia, wherein our minds automatically detect familiar patterns, particularly faces, even in randomness or incomplete information. When we encounter someone who shares significant physical characteristics with ourselves or another person we know, our brains rapidly process these similarities and construct a narrative of connection, of destiny, of parallel existence, filling in gaps with assumptions and associations that feel intuitively true even when subjected to rational scrutiny. Additionally, the phenomenon taps into our deep psychological ambivalence about identity itself. The simultaneous desire to believe ourselves unique and irreplaceable, while also harboring a secret curiosity about who we might have been under different circumstances, what alternate versions of ourselves might be doing in other places, making different choices, living different lives. The persistence of doppelganger beliefs despite overwhelming logical objections, despite the mathematical improbability of perfect strangers sharing identical features, speaks to something fundamental in human consciousness. Our reluctance to accept that identity is singular and isolated, our yearning for connection to something greater than ourselves, our intuitive sense that the boundaries between self and other might be more permeable and mysterious than empirical science suggests. We have normalized these encounters not through evidence or verification, but through the sheer cultural weight of their repetition, through the comfort they provide in suggesting that somewhere, another version of us is living out different possibilities, that consciousness and identity might extend beyond the singular body we inhabit, that the universe operates with a kind of poetic symmetry that defies our rational frameworks. In this way, the doppelganger becomes less a biological or statistical curiosity and more a psychological artifact, a mirror in which we project our deepest uncertainties about the nature of identity, existence, and whether the self we know is truly singular or merely one manifestation of an infinite pattern repeating across the vast landscape of human experience. Perhaps this explains why the doppelganger has remained such a potent figure across literature and film, not as a scientific phenomenon requiring explanation, but as a symbolic expression of humanity's enduring fascination with the infinite possibilities contained within a single life, and our haunting suspicion that somewhere beyond the boundaries of our perception, there exists another consciousness wearing our face, living the life we might have lived. Imagine standing at the threshold of a decision, any decision, and feeling the weight of infinite possibility pressing down upon you with the force of something both terrifying and oddly comforting. This is the essence of Everett Branches, a concept drawn from Hugh Everett's many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which suggests that every quantum event that could have multiple outcomes actually does produce all of those outcomes, each occurring in its own separate branch of reality that splits off from the original universe like diverging paths in an endlessly expanding forest. When you choose to turn left instead of right, or accept a job offer instead of declining it, or speak words that change someone's life, you are not simply foreclosing one possibility in favor of another. Rather, according to this interpretation, you are actually spawning an entirely new universe in which the alternative choice was made, complete with all its consequences, rippling forward infinitely into futures you will never experience. The psychological mechanism that makes this concept so compelling to the human mind lies in our deep-seated need to resolve the existential pain of choice itself, the burden of opportunity cost that haunts every decision we make. We live with the constant awareness that at every moment we are selecting one life from an infinite array of potential lives we might have lived, and this awareness creates a subtle but persistent anxiety that accompanies consciousness itself. The concept of Everett Branches offers a peculiar form of psychological relief by suggesting that we do not have to choose at all, that all versions of ourselves continue to exist somewhere in the vast multiverse, living out every possible iteration of our lives simultaneously. This transforms the agony of choice into something approaching a cosmic inevitability, where guilt and regret become somewhat meaningless because every path is being walked by some version of you, somewhere, in some branch of reality beyond your perception. We have normalized this concept in contemporary culture through science fiction, through popular television and literature that explores alternate timelines and parallel universes with increasing sophistication, until the idea that infinite versions of ourselves exist in branching realities has become almost commonplace in the realm of speculative thinking. Yet despite the conceptual elegance of many worlds' interpretation, and despite the philosophical comfort it offers, we continue to feel the weight of our individual choices as if they matter absolutely, as if each decision genuinely forecloses possibilities rather than merely determining which branch of the multiverse we will inhabit and experience. We go about our lives acting as though our choices are consequential and singular, as though the path we did not take is genuinely lost to us, even while we intellectually entertain the possibility that it continues somewhere else, lived by another version of ourselves we will never meet. This persistent tension between the theoretical comfort of infinite parallel lives and the practical reality of our subjective, singular experience suggests something profound about human consciousness. That we cannot truly escape the burden of choice, that no amount of theoretical framework can actually relieve us of the existential weight that comes with being a conscious entity that must decide, moment after moment, which branch of life to inhabit, which version of ourselves to become. Perhaps this is why we simultaneously cling to the comfort of Everett Branches while refusing to truly believe in it. Because a life in which every choice matters absolutely, in which consequences are real and singular and irreversible, is ultimately a life that feels more authentically our own than one dispersed across infinite variations we can never access or know. Consider the experience of standing at a crossroads in your life, contemplating a decision that will alter your future in fundamental ways. And in that moment of hesitation, you find yourself wondering about all the versions of yourself that might emerge from each possible choice you could make, all the parallel lives that branch outward from this singular instant of decision, each one equally real in some abstract philosophical sense. Existing in some realm beyond our perception, yet somehow present in the landscape of possibility. This is the intuition that modal realism seeks to formalize into a comprehensive metaphysical framework, proposed most thoroughly by the philosopher David Lewis in the 1970s, a theory that suggests that not only is our actual world real, but all logically possible worlds are equally real, existing in a vast multiverse of concrete actualities that are fundamentally identical in their ontological status, whether or not we happen to inhabit them. The mechanism behind this theory rests on a particular way of understanding possibility and actuality themselves, for modal realism argues that when we say something is possible, we are not merely speaking about abstract concepts or logical constructs, but rather referring to genuine concrete worlds in which those possibilities are actualized, worlds that are just as real as our own but causally disconnected from us. Existing in what might be termed parallel dimensions of reality that are not accessible to our observation, but are nonetheless concretely instantiated somewhere in the vast fabric of metaphysical space. The psychological appeal of modal realism lies in its capacity to render all possibilities equally substantial, to dissolve the distinction between the actual and the merely possible by arguing that possibility itself requires actuality, that there must be something real that instantiates every logically consistent scenario, every alternative history, every life path not taken, every universe where different physical laws obtain and different events transpired. This theory persists in contemporary philosophical discourse despite its counterintuitive implications and the absence of any empirical verification, perhaps because it offers a kind of metaphysical comfort, a suggestion that all the roads not taken still exist somewhere in a concrete form, that the version of yourself who made the opposite choice, who pursued the different career, who chose the other partner, actually exists in some real sense rather than remaining merely imaginary or hypothetical, granting a peculiar kind of immortality and reality to every possible variation of existence that could logically cohere. Yet this consoling vision comes at a steep philosophical price, for modal realism demands we accept that infinite concrete worlds exist beyond our ken, populated by countless versions of ourselves living out every conceivable variation of human experience, a metaphysical extravagance that transforms our intuitive sense of a singular, privileged reality into merely one instance among an incomprehensibly vast and largely inaccessible cosmos. The critic's objection cuts swiftly to the heart of the matter. If these possible worlds are truly causally isolated from us, utterly beyond our access or influence, then what meaningful difference does their existence make to our understanding of reality? And doesn't modal realism collapse into a kind of metaphysical speculation that explains nothing about the world we actually inhabit and observe? In response, the modal realist might contend that possibility itself requires this ontological commitment, that to say, I could have chosen differently, demands that some world exists where I did. Yet this reply merely restates the theory, rather than addressing whether such inaccessible realities have any explanatory force or bearing on how we navigate the singular world we experience and must act within. Imagine standing in a vast library where every book ever written exists simultaneously on infinite shelves, each volume representing a moment in time frozen in place, and you, as the reader, move through this library with what feels like consciousness and choice, yet every word on every page was already written before you were born. This is the essence of the block universe theory, a concept emerging from Einstein's theory of relativity that fundamentally challenges our intuitive understanding of time, free will, and the nature of existence itself. In this framework, time is not flowing forward from past to future in the way our daily experience suggests. Rather, all moments that have ever existed and all moments that will ever exist are equally real and equally present in a four-dimensional space-time continuum that physicists call the block. Just as we perceive width, height, and depth as spatial dimensions that all exist simultaneously in three-dimensional space, the block universe posits that past, present, and future all exist simultaneously in four-dimensional space-time, with time functioning as merely another dimension like any other physical dimension. The mechanism underlying this theory stems from the mathematical structure of Einstein's relativity equations, which treat time and space symmetrically, suggesting that time possesses the same static quality as space rather than flowing or changing as our consciousness experiences it. When we observe that light takes time to reach us from distant stars, that simultaneous events in one reference frame are non-simultaneous in another, that time dilates near massive objects and accelerates at different rates depending on velocity, we discover that the fabric of spacetime itself is interwoven in ways that make the conventional arrow of time appear to be merely a perspective created by conscious observers within the block, rather than a fundamental feature of reality itself. Yet despite the mathematical elegance and empirical support from relativity physics, the block universe remains deeply counterintuitive to human consciousness, which persistently experiences time as flowing, as containing genuine novelty, as offering authentic choices between genuine possibilities. We continue to feel that the present moment holds a special ontological status compared to the past and future, that our decisions matter because they shape an open future, even though the block universe suggests that our sense of making choices is perhaps an elaborate illusion woven into the fabric of a predetermined four-dimensional structure, where every choice we believe we are making was already eternally present in the cosmic architecture before our birth. This paradox that we feel genuinely free while living in a universe where all moments exist eternally fixed may represent not a flaw in the block universe theory, but rather a fundamental mystery about the nature of consciousness itself, suggesting that subjective experience and objective reality operate according to different logics that we have yet to reconcile. Perhaps the deepest insight the block universe offers is not that free will is illusory, but that our experience of making choices and the predetermined nature of those choices are not actually contradictory. They are simply descriptions of the same events viewed from different perspectives, much like how an object can be simultaneously a particle and a wave depending on how we observe it. Suggesting that freedom and determinism might be complementary aspects of reality rather than mutually exclusive opposites. In this view, a person deliberating over a difficult moral choice experiences genuine deliberation and authentic agency in the moment, while simultaneously that choice exists as an unchangeable feature of spacetime's eternal architecture. Both descriptions are equally valid, neither diminishes the other. Imagine standing at the precipice of a profound realization that every moment you have ever lived, every decision you have made, every conversation you have had with another person will repeat itself infinitely and eternally, cycling through the cosmos in exactly the same way, an endless loop of identical lives stretching backward into the infinite past and forward into the infinite future, with no beginning and no end, only the perpetual return of the same events in the same order. This is the concept of eternal recurrence, a philosophical notion that emerged prominently through the work of Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century, though its roots trace far deeper into ancient philosophy and Eastern thought, presenting us with a vertiginous vision of existence that challenges our fundamental understanding of time, choice, and meaning. The theory proposes that the universe is cyclical rather than linear, that all matter and energy will eventually return to their original configuration after an incomprehensibly vast span of time, and that this process will repeat itself eternally, meaning that you have lived this exact life countless times before and will live it countless times again, in precisely the same way, with the same joys and sorrows, the same mistakes and triumphs. The same final moment of death followed by rebirth into the same beginning. The psychological mechanism that sustains this theory's appeal lies in its profound challenge to our sense of uniqueness and agency, for if everything recurs eternally, then our choices possess a strange dual nature. They are simultaneously completely free and completely determined, both utterly meaningful and utterly meaningless, and this paradox creates a kind of cognitive vertigo that forces us to confront the deepest questions about what it means to live at all. When we truly contemplate eternal recurrence, we find ourselves asking whether we would live our lives differently if we knew they would repeat forever, whether there are moments we would choose to erase or relive, and this contemplation can either paralyze us with despair or awaken us to a radical acceptance of existence as it actually is, without the comfort of redemption or escape. The theory persists in our collective consciousness despite its apparent logical impossibilities because it taps into something deeply human. Our intuitive sense that time might not be what we perceive, that the arrow of time might be an illusion, and that somewhere in the vast architecture of the cosmos, all moments might exist simultaneously in some form of eternal present, equally real, equally vivid, equally alive. What makes eternal recurrence so disturbing and so fascinating is that it obliterates the distinction between fate and freedom, between the predetermined and the chosen, between past and future, collapsing all of human existence into a single eternal moment that somehow contains infinite moments, a paradox that our waking minds struggle to grasp, but that our sleeping minds seem to recognize as fundamentally true, which may explain why we return to this concept again and again. Why it appears in so many religious traditions and philosophical systems, why it haunts us even as we dismiss it as logically impossible. Perhaps this is why the concept resurfaces most powerfully in moments of personal crisis or transformation, when we stand at a threshold and wonder whether we are truly choosing a new path or merely playing out a scene we have already lived infinite times before, and why the thought of eternal recurrence can serve as either a curse that robs us of hope or a liberation that frees us to embrace existence exactly as it manifests. In this way, eternal recurrence becomes less a metaphysical claim about the structure of time and more a practical philosophy, a mirror held up to examine whether we are truly living our lives or merely sleepwalking through them, whether we are willing to say yes to existence in its totality, with all its suffering and beauty intertwined inseparably, or whether we remain forever trapped in the fantasy of an escape that will never come. In the quiet hours before dawn, countless individuals across the world report experiencing a profound and unsettling phenomenon where they find themselves separated from their physical bodies, floating above their beds, or traveling through ethereal landscapes with perfect clarity and vivid sensory detail, all while their bodies remain motionless below them in a state of apparent sleep, yet something far stranger than ordinary dreaming. These individuals describe the sensation with remarkable consistency. A peculiar vibration throughout their entire physical form, followed by a distinct feeling of their consciousness lifting away from their corporeal shell, as though some essential aspect of their being has become suddenly untethered from the flesh and bone that normally contains it, able to move freely through solid objects and navigate impossible geometries that obey none of the laws governing the physical world we inhabit during waking hours. The experience typically begins during the twilight state between sleep and wakefulness, when the mind remains conscious, but the body has entered the paralysis that naturally accompanies rapid eye movement sleep. And during these suspended moments, people report that they possess complete lucidity, rational thought, and the ability to make conscious decisions about where they wish to travel and what they wish to observe in this supposed parallel existence. What neurologists and sleep researchers have discovered through careful scientific study is that astral projection experiences correspond precisely with the phenomenon known as sleep paralysis combined with lucid dreaming, a state where the brain's consciousness centers remain active while the motor cortex that controls voluntary muscle movement remains chemically suppressed, preventing the body from acting out the movements that occur within dreams. And this fascinating intersection of wakefulness and sleep generates extraordinarily vivid hallucinations that feel absolutely authentic because they are generated by the same sensory processing regions of the brain that create our perception of waking reality. The brain, when caught between these two states, sometimes generates the compelling sensation of floating or falling, creates phantom vibrations that feel entirely physical and real, and produces detailed visual and spatial experiences that possess the same quality of presence as genuine perception, all while the person remains acutely aware and capable of thought, leading them to interpret these neurological events as something metaphysical rather than recognizing them as the remarkable but entirely explainable firing patterns of a brain caught between states of consciousness. Yet despite the availability of scientific explanations rooted in sleep physiology and neurobiology, the belief in astral projection as a genuine separation of some non-physical consciousness from the body persists across cultures and centuries, maintained by the subjective power of the experience itself, the seeming coherence and realism of the sensation, the countless testimonies of people convinced they have truly left their bodies. And perhaps most importantly, by the deep human yearning to believe that consciousness itself is something more fundamental and less bound by the physical than our rational understanding suggests, allowing us to continue entertaining the possibility that we might be more than merely the electrochemical patterns generated by our brains despite all evidence pointing toward the opposite conclusion. This tension between subjective experience and objective explanation remains unresolved for many believers, who argue that the consistency of astral projection accounts across diverse cultures. From ancient Hindu descriptions of the subtle body to modern Western reports of near-identical phenomena, suggests something genuine underlying the experience, even if science has yet to develop the proper framework to measure or validate what that something might be. Imagine a person lying in a darkened room, guided by a trained hypnotherapist through a series of carefully constructed visualizations, their consciousness apparently drifting backward through time itself until they arrive at vivid scenes of lives they claim to have lived centuries ago, complete with sensory details, emotional resonance, and a profound sense of authenticity that feels entirely real from the inside. In these sessions, individuals describe themselves as medieval peasants, ancient warriors, Renaissance merchants, or countless other historical figures, often with remarkable specificity about clothing, architecture, social customs, and personal relationships that seem far too detailed to be conscious invention. The memories emerge spontaneously during deep hypnotic states, accompanied by emotional releases, physical sensations, and an overwhelming conviction that these experiences actually occurred, that consciousness itself transcended death and reincarnation to enter new bodies across different historical periods and geographical locations. The therapeutic framework suggests that present-day anxieties, phobias, relationship patterns, and even inexplicable physical ailments might trace directly back to traumatic deaths or unresolved conflicts from these purported previous existences, and that accessing and processing these ancient memories can produce genuine healing in the current lifetime. The psychological mechanism underlying past life regression appears to operate through the extraordinary suggestibility of the hypnotic state, combined with the human mind's remarkable capacity for narrative construction and confabulation, whereby the unconscious generates elaborate, internally consistent stories that feel subjectively authentic because the mind cannot easily distinguish between vividly imagined experiences and genuine memories. Hypnotic regression may also activate procedural memory, semantic knowledge, and cultural information absorbed throughout a person's lifetime that the conscious mind cannot consciously access, but which emerges as apparent recollection of past lives. Yet despite the complete absence of any scientifically verified mechanism for consciousness surviving death, despite the lack of any repeatable evidence that memories can persist across bodily destruction and rebirth, despite the overwhelming likelihood that past life narratives emerge from imagination, cultural knowledge, and the suggestive power of therapeutic context rather than genuine historical recall. The practice persists and flourishes across contemporary Western culture, particularly among spiritually oriented populations who find the framework emotionally satisfying and psychologically meaningful, demonstrating once again how powerfully our minds can generate subjective experiences of profound authenticity regardless of their actual objective foundation. What makes past life regression particularly compelling is that the therapeutic benefits, reduced anxiety, resolved phobias, newfound sense of purpose, appear genuine regardless of whether the memories are real, suggesting that the healing power may lie not in historical accuracy, but in the narrative coherence and emotional catharsis that emerge when people construct meaningful explanations for their present suffering. This paradox, where psychological efficacy becomes decoupled from empirical truth, reveals something profound about human consciousness. That meaning-making itself may be the primary therapeutic agent, and that a compelling narrative about the origins of suffering can facilitate genuine transformation regardless of whether that narrative corresponds to historical fact, suggesting that past life regression ultimately functions as a sophisticated form of narrative psychotherapy dressed in the language of reincarnation. In Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, there exists a concept known as the Bardo, which refers to the intermediate states of consciousness that occur between death and rebirth, but more broadly, it describes any liminal space where the soul or consciousness exists in transition between one state of being and another. The Bardo is not merely a religious doctrine confined to ancient texts, but rather a framework that contemporary psychology and neuroscience have begun to recognize in the lived experiences of people across cultures who report profound alterations in consciousness, temporal perception, and identity during moments of extreme transition. Consider the experience of someone in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, when the mind seems to exist in a peculiar space between full awareness and complete dissociation, where time becomes malleable and the sense of self feels unstable and fragmented. During these moments, people often describe feeling neither fully present in their body nor entirely absent from it, inhabiting instead a ghostly intermediate realm where normal rules of causality and identity seem suspended. The mechanism behind this psychological state operates through the nervous system's response to overwhelming stimuli, wherein the brain essentially locks between fight-or-flight activation and complete shutdown, creating a dissociative state that functionally mirrors the Bardo description of existing between worlds. Similarly, consider the phenomenon of sleep paralysis, where a person becomes conscious while their body remains locked in the REM sleep state, leaving them aware yet unable to move, caught between wakefulness and sleep, between the physical world and the dream realm. In these moments, people frequently report encountering presences, experiencing profound dread or transcendence, and perceiving their consciousness as somehow separated from their physical form, describing experiences almost identical to Bardo accounts documented in Tibetan texts centuries before modern neuroscience could explain the neurological mechanisms. The concept also appears in near-death experiences, where individuals who have been resuscitated report moving through tunnel-like passages, encountering light and beings, and experiencing a sense of being between life and death, existing in a liminal space that seems to possess its own logic and rules distinct from either life or death as we ordinarily understand them. What persists despite our scientific understanding of these states is the genuine sense, reported again and again by those who experience them, that consciousness itself continues in these intermediate zones, that awareness does not simply cease to exist or transform, but somehow persists in an altered form that transcends the binary categories we normally use to describe states of being. We have largely normalized the existence of these states without fully integrating their implications, acknowledging them as neurological phenomena while simultaneously failing to explain why they produce such consistent reports of meaningful experience, spiritual insight, and profound transformation across centuries and cultures that had no contact with one another. Perhaps what the Bardo reveals is not a failure of scientific explanation, but rather the limitations of our current frameworks for understanding consciousness itself. The possibility that subjective experience during these liminal states operates according to principles we have not yet developed the conceptual language or measurement tools to fully comprehend, suggesting that the territory of human consciousness extends beyond the maps we have drawn. until we develop a more sophisticated understanding of consciousness that honors both the measurable correlates of neurological activity and the irreducible qualities of subjective experience. The Bardo will remain what it has always been, a mirror held up to the deepest mysteries of what it means to be aware, to transition, and to persist through states of being that refuse to fit neatly into our categories of alive or dead, real or imagined, self or other. Imagine standing in a room where you suddenly feel an overwhelming sense of dread moments before receiving a phone call informing you of a tragedy that occurred hours earlier in a distant place. And yet your body seemed to know it was coming before the information could have possibly reached you through any conventional means of communication or sensory perception. This phenomenon, often referred to as retrocausality, represents one of the most perplexing theoretical frameworks for understanding how effects might precede their causes, challenging our fundamental assumptions about the arrow of time and the sequential nature of reality itself. In quantum physics, retrocausality emerges not as mysticism, but as a serious mathematical possibility, where particles appear to communicate backwards through time, or where measurements made in the present seem to influence the states of particles in the past. A principle that has fascinated physicists for decades and continues to generate experimental inquiry into the nature of temporal mechanics. When we examine human experience through this lens, we begin to notice patterns of apparent precognition, moments of inexplicable intuition that guide us away from danger, creative insights that seem to arrive fully formed from some future version of ourselves, and the curious phenomenon of déjà vu, where we feel we have experienced a moment before it actually occurs, suggesting that perhaps consciousness itself operates under different temporal rules than our ordinary perception suggests. The mechanism underlying these experiences appears to involve a kind of resonance between our current psychological state and information or patterns that exist outside the normal flow of time, where the deeper layers of our mind might be processing signals that haven't yet entered our conscious awareness, or where our intuitive systems have somehow tapped into probability fields that extend beyond the present moment into both past and future. Some theoretical frameworks propose that human consciousness exists not as a strictly linear phenomenon bound to the present instant, but rather as a multidimensional awareness that can access information across temporal boundaries, particularly in states of deep relaxation, meditation, or heightened emotional sensitivity, when our rational gatekeeping mechanisms are sufficiently quieted to allow such information to permeate into our conscious mind. What remains remarkable is how persistently these experiences occur across cultures, throughout history, and even within the lives of skeptics who rationally dismiss them, suggesting that retrocausality, whether grounded in quantum mechanics or in the deeper architecture of consciousness itself, represents something fundamental about reality that we have not yet adequately explained or integrated into our scientific worldview, and yet we continue forward. Acknowledging these strange moments while filing them away as anomalies rather than signals pointing toward a more nuanced understanding of time, causality, and the profound mystery of human awareness. Perhaps the most honest acknowledgement we can make is that retrocausality asks us not to abandon reason, but to expand it, to recognize that the universe may operate according to principles far more intricate than our current models allow, and that the sudden knowing, the intuitive leap, and the dream that precedes the event may all be valid forms of information worthy of serious contemplation rather than dismissal. In this light, the scientist who dismisses a hunch and later discovers it would have led to a breakthrough, or the parent who inexplicably holds their child closer on the very night danger approaches, may be participating in a subtle temporal dialogue with their own future, a conversation across time that whispers through the body's wisdom long before the rational mind can comprehend what it already knows. Imagine a cosmic library existing beyond the physical realm, a universal database containing every thought, emotion, action, and event that has ever occurred across all of time and space, accessible only through altered states of consciousness or spiritual attunement, and you begin to understand the concept of the Akashic Records, a belief system that has persisted across cultures and centuries, from ancient Hindu and Buddhist traditions to modern New Age spirituality, suggesting that a field of infinite knowledge surrounds us all, waiting to be tapped into by those with sufficient spiritual development or intuitive ability. The idea suggests that certain individuals, whether they identify as psychics, mystics, channelers, or simply spiritually evolved beings, can access these records during meditation, hypnosis, or spontaneous moments of expanded awareness, retrieving information about past lives, present circumstances, future possibilities, and universal truths that conventional science cannot measure or verify. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief operates through several overlapping frameworks. First, it provides a comforting explanation for inexplicable knowledge or intuition that people sometimes experience, transforming the unsettling mystery of sudden insight into a systematic universe where everything connects and nothing is truly random or unknowable. Second, it appeals to humanity's fundamental desire to believe in a meaningful, ordered cosmos where consciousness extends beyond individual minds, offering solace to those troubled by mortality and the seeming meaninglessness of isolated existence. Third, it validates subjective experiences that people cannot otherwise explain, such as déjà vu, premonitions, or the sensation of remembering lives they never lived, converting these psychological phenomena into evidence of contact with actual cosmic records. The Akashic Records concept has become deeply normalized within certain spiritual communities and has even influenced therapeutic practices, with practitioners conducting regression therapy or intuitive readings while explicitly or implicitly referencing access to these non-physical archives, lending them an air of legitimacy and professional framework despite the complete absence of reproducible evidence, testable mechanisms, or any scientific means of verification or falsification. What makes the Akashic Records particularly resistant to scientific scrutiny is precisely this feature. The belief system is constructed in such a way that negative evidence, the failure to demonstrate these records exist, becomes reinterpreted as confirmation that one simply lacks sufficient spiritual development or proper attunement, transforming the unfalsifiable claim into an unfalsifiable belief that can accommodate any outcome or observation without ever requiring revision. This self-protecting logical structure, where belief strengthens through failed verification rather than successful demonstration, represents one of the most psychologically sophisticated forms of unfalsifiable thinking, ensuring that the Akashic Records remain forever beyond reach of empirical challenge while remaining perpetually accessible to subjective interpretation and personal conviction. Yet this very unfalsifiability reveals something profound about human cognition. We are pattern-seeking creatures desperate to find meaning and connection, and the Akashic Records concept succeeds precisely because it speaks to this deep psychological need, offering what amounts to a spiritualized version of confirmation bias wrapped in the language of cosmic truth. In this way, the records function less as an actual knowledge system and more as a mirror reflecting back our own desires for transcendence, purpose, and access to mysteries beyond the reach of ordinary consciousness. Consider the peculiar experience of existing in the transitional spaces between one life phase and another, those mysterious intervals where you are no longer who you were but not yet who you will become. A suspended state that many spiritual traditions and psychological frameworks suggest may hold profound significance that we have largely overlooked in our modern understanding of consciousness and personal transformation. The life between lives represents not a metaphorical concept, but rather a distinct state of being that occurs repeatedly throughout our existence, such as the moment after you resign from a career, but before you begin a new one, or the period following a relationship's end, but preceding genuine emotional recovery, or even the strange hours between waking from a vivid dream and fully engaging with the day ahead, where your consciousness seems to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. During these intervals, people report experiencing heightened intuition, unusual synchronicities, profound clarity about their true desires, and a distinct sense that they are receiving guidance or messages from something beyond ordinary perception, as though the thin boundaries between one identity and another create a permeable membrane through which deeper wisdom can flow. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon may relate to the natural dissolution of the ego structures that maintain our ordinary sense of self, a temporary weakening of the psychological scaffolding that keeps us locked into habitual patterns, familiar responses, and the accumulated beliefs about who we are that we have constructed throughout our lives. When this scaffolding temporarily collapses during transitions, we gain access to a more fundamental layer of consciousness, one that is not yet constrained by the new identity we are developing or bound by the limitations of the old one we are shedding, creating a unique window of potential and perception that remains open only briefly before our psyche reconstructs its defensive architecture around our new circumstances. What makes this phenomenon particularly intriguing is how completely we have normalized and overlooked its significance, despite the overwhelming consistency with which people across cultures and centuries have reported profound experiences during liminal periods, treating these transitions as merely logistical necessities rather than sacred thresholds. Practical problems to be navigated as quickly as possible, rather than profound initiatory experiences worthy of our deliberate attention and respect. Yet the evidence persistently suggests that those who consciously honor these between-live spaces, who spend time in quiet reflection and receptivity rather than rushing to fill the void with new activities and identities, report lasting transformations that those who avoid or deny the transitional period tend never to achieve, as though the universe is continually offering us these opportunities for genuine metamorphosis. And we are systematically declining them through our cultural insistence on perpetual productivity and continuous identity. Perhaps the most radical act available to us in our modern world is simply to pause, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, to resist the urge to prematurely construct a new identity, and to trust that the wisdom emerging in these liminal spaces is not a luxury, but an essential recalibration that determines the quality and authenticity of everything that follows. In this sense, the between-lives space functions as a crucible for authentic becoming, the difference between merely exchanging one mask for another and actually evolving into a truer expression of who you are meant to become. When we deny ourselves this threshold time, we condemn ourselves to live as reactive beings, perpetually shaped by external circumstances rather than consciously authored lives, forever running from one constructed identity into the next without ever touching the ground of our own genuine being. Imagine standing at a point in spacetime where the very fabric of reality folds back upon itself, where the future and past are not distant destinations, but geometrically connected loops that curve through the cosmos in such a way that a traveler might journey forward through time and space only to arrive at their own point of origin, meeting themselves at the exact moment they departed. Creating a paradoxical loop where cause and effect lose their linear meaning and become entangled in a way that defies our intuitive understanding of how time should behave. This is the essence of a closed Timelike curve, a theoretical solution that emerges from the equations of general relativity itself, suggesting that under extreme conditions involving massive rotating objects like Kerr black holes or exotic matter distributions, the geometry of spacetime could actually permit such impossible journeys, where the worldline of a particle or observer could form a closed loop in spacetime rather than extending infinitely forward. The mechanisms that allow such curves to exist are rooted in the mathematics of Einstein's field equations, which describe how matter and energy curve the fabric of spacetime around them, and under precisely configured arrangements of mass and angular momentum or exotic negative energy density, these equations permit solutions where the normally forward-pointing arrow of time becomes curved back upon itself, creating topological structures in spacetime that would allow world lines to return to their starting points without ever exceeding the speed of light locally. Yet despite the mathematical legitimacy of these solutions within general relativity, closed timelike curves remain deeply problematic for our understanding of causality and physical law, presenting the famous grandfather paradox where a time traveler could theoretically prevent their own birth or existence, creating logical contradictions that seem to demand some fundamental principle of nature that prevents such curves from actually forming, or that enforces a self-consistent resolution to any apparent paradoxes. And the persistence of these solutions in our most successful theory of gravity creates an unsettling tension between mathematical possibility and physical reality. Remarkably, many physicists have simply accepted this peculiar feature as an integral if bizarre element of our universe, with some proposing mechanisms like the Novikov self-consistency principle that suggests the laws of physics would automatically prevent any timeline-altering actions, or the many worlds interpretation where paradoxes are resolved through branching realities, allowing closed timelike curves to exist theoretically while remaining functionally impossible in practice. And this normalization of the impossible represents a profound surrender to mathematical authority, where we have learned to coexist with theoretical predictions that violate our deepest intuitions about how causality and time should function. Yet perhaps this acceptance reflects something deeper about the nature of physical theory itself, that mathematics can describe possibilities without guaranteeing their realization, and that the universe may possess an elegant self-protective mechanism built into its fundamental laws that simply renders closed timelike curves inaccessible to any conscious observer, forever confining them to the realm of theoretical curiosities rather than practical engineering projects. In this way, closed timelike curves stand as a humbling reminder that the deepest laws of physics often permit what intuition forbids, and that our universe may be far stranger than even our most mathematically sophisticated theories dare to fully acknowledge. Operating according to principles we have yet to discover that govern which theoretical possibilities are actually woven into the fabric of reality, and which remain forever sealed behind the boundaries of physical law. Imagine that the universe as we perceive it is not a singular, isolated entity, but rather a thin membrane or brain floating through a vastly higher dimensional space, and that there exist other brains just like ours, parallel to our own, separated by distances so infinitesimally small at the quantum scale, yet so catastrophically vast at the cosmic scale that we may never directly perceive them. And further imagine that these brains occasionally collide with one another in the higher dimensional void, creating ripples and disturbances that cascade through both universes simultaneously, affecting matter, energy, and the fundamental constants themselves in ways we might interpret as mysterious anomalies or unexplained phenomena in our own reality. This is the essence of Brane collision theory, a legitimate framework emerging from string theory and M-theory that suggests our Big Bang itself may have been the result of just such a collision, a violent meeting between two higher dimensional structures that released unimaginable energy and set in motion the expansion and evolution of everything we observe today. The psychological mechanism that makes this theory compelling despite its abstract nature is our innate tendency to seek patterns and causes for the universe's apparent discontinuities, our deep discomfort with randomness and isolation, and our persistent belief that we exist within a larger context whose true dimensions we cannot fathom but might someday understand. When we contemplate Brane collisions, we are essentially engaging in a form of reassurance, a way of acknowledging that our universe and our own existence may be far more contingent and cosmically ordinary than we would like to believe, yet simultaneously extraordinary in ways that transcend our current perceptual and mathematical frameworks. We have quietly accepted this theory despite its profound implications, because it rests comfortably within the realm of peer-reviewed physics rather than science fiction, because it offers a mechanistic explanation for some of the deepest mysteries in cosmology, and because the alternative, admitting that we may never truly understand the universe's origins or fundamental nature, proves far more psychologically unsettling than accepting a theory about invisible membranes colliding in dimensions we cannot access. The reality remains that Brane collision theory, while scientifically respectable, remains almost entirely unfalsifiable and beyond our current observational capacity, yet we grant it substantial intellectual real estate in our cosmological models, demonstrating how readily we embrace profound uncertainty when it wears the appropriate academic regalia. Yet when we examine the gravitational anomalies at the edges of galaxies, the unexplained asymmetries in cosmic radiation, or the puzzling fine-tuning of physical constants, we find ourselves naturally gravitating toward Brane collision explanations, not because they are demonstrably superior to competing theories, but because they provide a narrative framework that transforms cosmic mystery into cosmic drama, transforming our helpless ignorance into a story of hidden dimensions and ancient collisions we might one day learn to read. In this way, Brane collision theory exemplifies how the most intellectually sophisticated explanations for reality often succeed not because they illuminate the cosmos, but because they satisfy our narrative hunger for a universe that operates according to comprehensible mechanical principles, even when those principles exist entirely beyond the reach of human observation or experimental verification. Perhaps most tellingly, we rarely pause to acknowledge that Brane collision theory serves a function identical to that of older cosmological myths. It provides a reassuring answer to the unanswerable, dressed in the language of contemporary mathematics rather than ancient metaphor, allowing us to feel we have progressed in our understanding when we have merely updated the costume of our cosmic bewilderment. Consider the experience of meeting someone and feeling an immediate, almost inexplicable sense of recognition, as though you have known them across lifetimes, as though your souls have been destined to find one another through the fabric of existence itself. This is the framework through which the twin flames concept operates in contemporary culture, a belief system that suggests each person possesses a single other soul, a perfect counterpart, split from one original entity at the beginning of time and scattered across the universe waiting to reunite. People who report experiencing this phenomenon describe a meeting that transcends ordinary romantic attraction, characterized by an intensity of connection that feels preternatural, a mirroring of mannerisms and thoughts, an uncanny synchronicity in the timing of calls and messages, and a sense of completion that suggests the other person fills some essential void that has existed since before conscious memory. The twin flames narrative has embedded itself deeply within spiritual and metaphysical discourse, proliferating across online communities, self-help literature, and social media platforms where individuals document their journeys toward union with their supposed counterpart, sharing stories of separation and yearning, of obstacles that test the validity of the connection, and of the ultimate promise of transcendent love and spiritual evolution that awaits when two halves become whole. The psychological mechanisms that generate and sustain belief in twin flames operate through several well-documented cognitive processes that shape human perception and memory in ways that feel profoundly meaningful, yet remain entirely explicable through neuroscience. When we encounter someone who shares significant characteristics with us, our brains employ a process called confirmation bias, actively seeking and emphasizing information that confirms the predetermined narrative while filtering out contradictory evidence. And this selective attention creates the illusion of a perfect cosmic match because we literally cannot perceive the incompatibilities that exist. The experience of synchronicity, those moments when thoughts align or communications overlap across distance, becomes amplified through the availability heuristic, wherein memorable coincidences dominate our thinking while the thousands of ordinary, non-coincidental moments fade into irrelevance, creating a statistical illusion of impossible connection. The intensity of the initial connection often correlates not with genuine compatibility, but with what psychologists term limerence, a state of involuntary romantic desire characterized by idealization, crystallization of the beloved's positive attributes, and a temporary alteration of cognitive function that essentially makes us hallucinate perfection in another person. Furthermore, the narrative of twin flames provides a profound psychological comfort because it promises that loneliness is impossible, that destiny has already solved the problem of human connection, and that we need only find the right person to experience permanent fulfillment, thereby removing the anxiety of choice and the responsibility of building relationships through sustained effort and compromise. Yet despite the clear psychological explanations for how this belief forms and perpetuates itself through normal human cognitive processes, the twin flames concept has not merely persisted, but has actually intensified in cultural prominence, becoming increasingly normalized within mainstream discourse about love and relationships despite having no empirical basis whatsoever. We have created entire industries and communities around this belief, with practitioners offering guidance on recognizing your twin flame, navigating the inevitable separation and reunion cycles, and understanding the spiritual lessons embedded in twin flame relationships that inevitably involve profound suffering, abandonment, and emotional trauma, rationalized as necessary spiritual purification. Imagine waking up one morning and feeling fundamentally different, as though the person inhabiting your body is not quite the same consciousness that fell asleep the night before. And indeed, there exists across many spiritual traditions and paranormal communities a peculiar framework known as the walk-in soul phenomenon, wherein it is believed that a soul can voluntarily leave its earthly vessel, while another discarnate spirit simultaneously enters and inhabits that same physical form, taking over the life, relationships, and identity of the original occupant, while the original soul moves on to other planes of existence or other dimensional realities. Those who report having experienced this transition describe a moment of profound discontinuity in their sense of self, a sudden absence of certain memories, a complete shift in personality preferences and emotional responses, and an inexplicable familiarity with a life and body they do not remember living. And often these individuals find themselves unable to recall childhoods or explain why they possess knowledge of events in their supposed past that feels borrowed rather than genuinely lived. Yet they retain the body's reflexive knowledge of how to walk and speak and navigate the world, suggesting that muscle memory and procedural knowledge remain intact even as autobiographical consciousness has fundamentally transformed. The psychological mechanism underlying this framework appears to operate through dissociation, and the human mind's remarkable capacity for narrative reconstruction, wherein a person experiencing genuine dissociative episodes or those who have survived profound trauma and undergo dramatic personality reorganization may seek an explanation that absolves them of continuity with their previous self, and the walk-in soul concept provides precisely such a framework. Allowing individuals to establish psychological distance from their former identity while remaining within a coherent metaphysical narrative that suggests transformation rather than fragmentation or loss of self. What remains striking is how persistently this explanation circulates within wellness communities and paranormal spaces, despite the abundance of well-documented psychological conditions that account far more parsimoniously for such experiences, including dissociative identity disorder, depersonalization derealization disorder, and the profound personality changes that accompany severe trauma. Yet the walk-in soul narrative endures because it transforms a frightening dissolution of identity into something spiritually meaningful and potentially purposeful, reframing the deeply unsettling experience of not feeling like oneself as evidence of cosmic significance rather than neurological distress. And in this way, we have collectively normalized an explanation that prioritizes metaphysical comfort over psychological investigation, allowing individuals to move through their lives feeling simultaneously alienated from their bodies and their pasts while remaining assured that this alienation represents not dysfunction, but rather a kind of celestial visitation, a spiritual upgrade, or a sacred transition that validates their disconnection as something chosen and intentional rather than something broken within them. Yet in doing so, we inadvertently discourage the very individuals most in need of trauma-informed care from seeking professional help, as the walk-in soul narrative offers them a ready-made mythology that explains their fragmentation without requiring them to process the rupture that caused it. And in this way, a framework meant to offer spiritual solace becomes instead a barrier to the healing that only genuine psychological integration can provide. The irony is profound. In seeking to transcend the pain of fragmentation through spiritual narrative, individuals remain trapped within it, their consciousness divided between the body they inhabit and the self they believe has departed, never quite fully present in either world, never quite fully healing in any of them. Imagine a person sitting alone in their home, experiencing a moment of profound internal division where they feel caught between two versions of themselves, one that seems to know exactly what they should do with their life and another that constantly resists this wisdom with doubt and fear. And they describe this phenomenon by saying that their higher self is trying to communicate with them across the distance of their own consciousness. A voice or presence that exists somewhere beyond their ordinary awareness, yet somehow intimately connected to their deepest knowing. This experience of feeling guided by an inner wisdom that seems separate from the everyday self is remarkably common across cultures and throughout human history, suggesting something fundamental about how consciousness perceives itself and organizes its own contradictions. The mechanism underlying this experience may be rooted in the simple fact that human beings contain multitudes of competing drives, values, and perspectives that have developed at different stages of our lives and evolution. So when we experience alignment with our deepest values or most authentic desires, we might interpret this as contact with a higher version of ourselves rather than simply recognizing it as the natural coherence of our integrated psychology. The higher self could represent the integration of our adult wisdom with our childhood dreams, or the alignment of our conscious intentions with our unconscious knowing, or perhaps the voice of our future self speaking backward through time to guide the present moment. Yet despite the psychological plausibility of these explanations, the concept persists with an almost mystical quality, wrapped in language that suggests transcendence and spiritual connection, and we have come to normalize speaking about our higher self as though it were a tangible entity with its own will and agency, an inner guide that exists at a frequency we must learn to access. Rather than simply acknowledging the remarkable sophistication of our own minds in organizing competing information into moments of profound clarity and direction. Perhaps this reframing, from mystical guidance to sophisticated self-organization, diminishes nothing of the experience's power. If anything, it deepens our appreciation for how the mind can access its own deepest wisdom when the noise of doubt and fear finally quiets enough to listen. And in those moments when we finally do listen, when we make a decision that feels unmistakably right, or find ourselves moving toward a goal we'd almost forgotten we cared about, we might recognize that we were never truly receiving guidance from somewhere else, but rather removing the obstacles that prevented us from hearing ourselves. The quiet moment when a person finally acts on advice they've been giving themselves for years, leaving a relationship, changing careers, returning to an education, becomes not an act of external salvation, but a simple decision to stop arguing with their own deepest knowing, to finally trust the wisdom that was there all along, waiting beneath the clutter. And perhaps this is why the language of the higher self persists so stubbornly in human culture, not because we are foolish or mystically inclined, but because we intuitively understand that the wisdom we need already lives within us, and sometimes we require the metaphor of an inner guide to grant ourselves permission to believe it. The mother who suddenly knows she must leave an abusive situation, the artist who recognizes they've been painting someone else's vision, the student who understands they chose a major to please their parents. Each of these moments of alignment with the higher self is simply the triumph of authentic self-knowledge over internalized doubt, a return to the self that was there before we learned to distrust it. Consider the peculiar human experience of living multiple lives simultaneously within a single physical existence, a phenomenon that manifests not through mystical reincarnation or supernatural splitting of consciousness, but rather through the compartmentalization of identity across different social, professional, and relational contexts. A person might be a meticulous accountant during business hours, speaking in measured tones and adhering to rigid protocols, then transform entirely into a free-spirited artist on weekends, adopting completely different mannerisms, vocabularies, and value systems. They might be a stern and authoritative parent within the home, yet become a vulnerable confidant to a therapist in a private office, revealing fears and insecurities that their own children have never witnessed. In some cases, individuals maintain entirely separate social circles that never intersect, with different names or nicknames used in different environments, different fashion choices, different emotional expressions, and different versions of their personal history shared depending on the audience. The versions are not lies exactly, but rather different facets of a multidimensional self, each authentic in its own context yet fundamentally different from the others. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates at the intersection of social psychology and neurological adaptation, wherein the human mind develops extraordinary capacity to modulate behavior based on contextual cues and perceived social expectations. Mirror neurons fire differently depending on whether we are in a board meeting or a casual conversation with childhood friends. The prefrontal cortex processes social information with remarkable speed, calculating appropriate responses to unspoken rules and hierarchies that vary dramatically between environments. Over time, these repeated performances become so ingrained that they feel natural, even automatic, and the individual may experience genuine cognitive dissonance when contemplating the existence of these alternate versions of themselves, almost as though acknowledging the multiplicity threatens the coherence of identity itself. What persists most puzzling about this concurrent incarnation is that we have collectively normalized it to such a degree that we rarely acknowledge its fundamental strangeness, treating it instead as an inevitable feature of mature social functioning rather than what it truly represents. The simultaneous existence of multiple partially distinct personalities within single consciousness, each with different patterns of thought, different emotional responses, and different ways of moving through the world. Yet perhaps this multiplicity is not a pathological fragmentation, but rather an adaptive necessity, the price of navigating a world that demands radically different competencies in radically different spaces. A silent acknowledgement that the unified self is itself a comforting fiction we maintain for psychological continuity rather than an accurate representation of the complex, context-dependent beings we actually are. And perhaps this is why the moment of exposure, when one incarnation unexpectedly encounters another, when a colleague stumbles upon your social media aesthetic, when your professional self must sit in a room with your familial self, can feel so destabilizing, as though the carefully maintained architecture of your identity suddenly reveals its fundamental fragility, forcing a confrontation with the unsettling truth that there may be no real you underneath, only an endless series of performances. Each one genuine and each one incomplete. Perhaps the most unsettling recognition is that we do not experience this multiplicity as fragmentation at all. We experience it as wholeness, each incarnation feeling complete and authentic in its moment, which suggests that the unified self we desperately defend may itself be the illusion, and the truth of human consciousness is that it was always meant to be polyphonic, a symphony of selves that only feels discordant when we insist on hearing a single note. Imagine standing at the edge of existence itself, where the boundaries between what is real and what merely could be dissolved into an infinite landscape of possibility, and you begin to understand the profound implications of Max Tegmark's mathematical universe hypothesis, which proposes that reality exists in four distinct hierarchical levels, each containing universes parallel to our own, yet fundamentally different in their nature and accessibility. At the first level, we encounter what Tegmark calls Level 1, which describes regions of space so distant from our observable universe that they operate beyond the cosmic horizon, yet they exist within the same quantum vacuum and follow the same physical laws that govern our own cosmos, meaning that somewhere in the infinite expanse of space, there exist infinite copies of our universe with infinite variations of ourselves living out every possible outcome of every possible choice. The mechanism underlying this concept rests upon the simple mathematical principle that if space is truly infinite, and if the number of quantum states available is finite, then through sheer statistical inevitability, every arrangement of matter and energy must eventually repeat, creating duplicates of galaxies, planets, and people distributed throughout the endless void, a notion that feels simultaneously comforting and vertiginous when contemplated deeply. Moving to Level 2, Tegmark proposes universes with different physical constants and fundamental laws, where the very equations that bind particles together might operate under entirely different parameters, creating worlds where gravity functions at different strengths or where atoms never form at all. Yet we accept this intellectually even though we possess no mechanism to observe or verify such realms. And this acceptance persists because mathematical consistency demands their existence within the broader structure of reality. Level 3 emerges from quantum mechanics itself, from the many worlds interpretation, which suggests that every quantum event generates branches in reality where all possible outcomes occur, creating a constantly fragmenting tree of universes where each decision point spawns new parallel worlds containing different versions of ourselves who made different choices. A concept so bizarre, yet so mathematically elegant, that physicists continue to seriously engage with it despite its absolute metaphysical strangeness. Finally, Level 4 represents Tegmark's most audacious proposal, suggesting that all mathematically consistent structures actually exist as real universes, implying that mathematics is not merely describing reality, but is reality itself, that every possible universe describable by mathematics has ontological reality somewhere in the landscape of existence. Creating a cosmic democracy, where the wildest imaginings of human mathematical creativity correspond to actual physical domains, populated with conscious beings experiencing those alien physical laws. The persistence of Tegmark's framework in serious scientific discourse, despite its seemingly impossible claims about parallel realities we can never access or verify, reveals something profound about how we have normalized the idea that reality extends far beyond the boundaries of human perception, accepting that the mathematical elegance of a theory might be more trustworthy than our immediate sensory experience, and in doing so, we have quietly revolutionized our understanding of existence itself from a single cosmos, containing everything that is into an infinite multiverse, where infinite versions of infinity contain infinite versions of us, living out infinite variations of infinite lives. Yet perhaps this expansion of reality's scope reflects not a discovery of external truth, but rather the limits of our conceptual frameworks, forcing us to confront whether we are uncovering the universe's deepest nature or simply describing the furthest reaches of what human mathematics can coherently imagine, a distinction that may itself be meaningless in a cosmos where thought and existence have become indistinguishable. Consider the peculiar experience of observing yourself making a decision in real time, as though there exists some internal observer watching your own thoughts unfold before you consciously claim them as your own, and you might begin to understand the foundation upon which the many minds theory rests, suggesting that within each human consciousness there operates not one unified observer, but rather a multiplicity of competing mental processes, each with its own perspective, preference, an interpretation of reality, all simultaneously active yet rarely acknowledged as separate entities deserving their own recognition. When you find yourself torn between two desires, experiencing genuine internal conflict that seems to pit one authentic part of yourself against another equally authentic part, you are potentially witnessing what proponents of this theory describe as the many minds in action, each one convinced of its own correctness and primacy within the landscape of your psychology. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears rooted in the fundamental architecture of human consciousness itself, for the brain evolved as a collection of specialized modules and systems, each designed to solve particular problems and serve specific functions, and while these systems have become increasingly integrated in the modern human mind, they have not become truly unified into a single coherent observer, but rather maintain their own semi-autonomous processing capabilities and motivational structures. Your rational mind that plans for tomorrow stands genuinely separate from your impulsive mind that desires immediate gratification, and your social mind that cares deeply about others genuinely diverges from your survival-oriented mind that prioritizes self-preservation. And each of these mental subsystems possesses what might be called its own perspective or even its own will. What makes this theory particularly compelling and somewhat unsettling is that we have normalized the existence of these multiple minds through our everyday language and behavior, speaking casually of being of two minds about something, or admitting that part of us wants one thing while another part wants something entirely different. Yet we rarely treat these observations as evidence of genuine plurality within consciousness, but rather continue to maintain the culturally reinforced fiction of a single unified self that somehow contains these contradictions without being fundamentally divided by them. We have created elaborate justifications and psychological frameworks to explain away the reality of our own multiplicity, attributing internal conflicts to weakness of will or lack of integration, when perhaps we are simply refusing to acknowledge that the unity we experience as ourself is more of an illusion maintained by narrative continuity than a reflection of the actual structure of our minds. And this persistent denial of what our own experience constantly demonstrates suggests that the idea of a singular, coherent, unified self may be one of the most profound illusions that human consciousness has managed to sustain, a comfortable myth we maintain precisely because acknowledging the true many-minded nature of our being would require us to fundamentally reimagine our sense of personal identity and responsibility in ways that our culture has not yet prepared us to accept. Yet perhaps this resistance itself serves a purpose, for a self that fully acknowledged its own multiplicity might struggle to maintain the coherence necessary for action, and so we persist in our useful fiction of unity, even as the many minds within us continue their quiet negotiations, each believing itself to be the true author of our choices. Perhaps this is why we experience guilt so acutely when we act against our own stated values, not because we have failed to be ourselves, but because we have allowed one mind among many to seize control, and somewhere within us another mind watches in helpless protest, equally convinced of its own righteousness, leaving us fractured between the person we believed we were and the person our actions have revealed us to be. Imagine standing in a quiet room at night, thinking intensely about someone you haven't spoken to in years, only to receive a message from them moments later, as though they sensed your thoughts across the distance and reached out in response. Or consider the phenomenon where you and a close friend or family member begin to mirror each other's behaviors, health conditions, emotional states, and life decisions in uncanny synchronicity, where one person's choice to change careers or move to a new city is followed weeks later by an identical decision from the other, despite no communication about such plans. These experiences suggest a deeper connection between certain individuals, one that operates beyond conventional explanation, a kind of quantum entanglement of consciousness, where two people seem fundamentally linked at a level that transcends physical separation and rational understanding. The mechanism underlying this theory proposes that human consciousness itself may exist in a state of quantum superposition, particularly between individuals who share deep emotional bonds or significant history, such that measuring or observing the state of one person's life simultaneously collapses the probability wave for the other, creating correlated outcomes that appear coincidental to external observers but feel purposeful to those experiencing them. This framework suggests that the universe may operate through connections far more intricate than our linear, causality-bound minds typically perceive, where thoughts are not confined to individual skulls but ripple outward through a shared quantum field that connects all consciousness. Yet despite our modern scientific understanding of quantum mechanics and its limitations when applied to macroscopic phenomena like human thought, this belief persists in our collective consciousness with remarkable tenacity, manifesting in widespread cultural acceptance of telepathy between loved ones, the uncanny frequency of mutual thinking, and the profound sense that certain people are simply meant to be in our lives, bound by invisible threads that neither distance nor time can sever. Suggesting that perhaps we have always sensed this deeper interconnection and simply lacked the language to articulate it until quantum physics offered us a plausible vocabulary for describing the inexplicable synchronicities that define the deepest human relationships. In this interpretation, the bond between twins who claim to feel each other's pain, or the parent who wakes moments before their child cries out in distress, becomes not mere coincidence, but evidence of a quantum connection so fundamental that it predates and transcends the separate emergence of individual identity, suggesting that consciousness itself may be less a property of isolated brains and more a localized expression of an underlying unified field that remembers and responds to itself across all the distances we imagine separate us. If this theory holds even a fragment of truth, it would fundamentally reshape our understanding of isolation itself, suggesting that loneliness may be not an absence of connection, but rather a failure of attention, a forgetting of the quantum threads that bind us to others, and that practices like meditation, intuitive listening, or simply holding someone in sustained thought might be less mystical and more like tuning a receiver to frequencies that have always been transmitting, waiting only for us to remember how to listen. In this light, the mother who instinctively knows her child is in danger thousands of miles away, or the longtime partners who finish each other's sentences without effort, may be operating within a shared quantum state where the boundary between self and other has grown so permeable that distinction itself becomes meaningless, suggesting that the deepest intimacy is not about merging two separate beings, but about recognizing that separation was always an illusion maintained by the limited bandwidth of ordinary perception. In the quiet regions of Scandinavia, particularly throughout Norway, there exists a phenomenon so peculiar and so deeply embedded in cultural memory that it has persisted for centuries despite rational examination and the march of modern science, a phenomenon known as the Vardoger, which translates roughly to forerunner or precursor in English, describing an experience where a person encounters what appears to be a duplicate of themselves performing their ordinary daily activities before they themselves arrive to perform those very same actions. Imagine arriving at your workplace on a cold morning in Oslo or a rural village in the Norwegian countryside, only to be greeted by colleagues who report that you had already arrived 30 minutes earlier, that you had already removed your coat and hung it on the familiar hook, that you had already started your coffee and settled into your routine. Yet when you search the building, you find no trace of this other self. And this encounter leaves no physical evidence beyond the testimony of witnesses who remain genuinely bewildered by what they have observed. The Vardoger represents a category of experience that sits uncomfortably between the psychological and the paranormal, one that demands explanation yet resists any singular answer. The mechanism underlying these encounters likely involves a complex interplay of human perception, expectation, and the curious ways in which memory and attention can create false certainties about events that never occurred. For when we expect someone to arrive at a particular time, our minds often construct detailed false memories of their arrival, complete with sensory specifics and emotional context that feel entirely authentic in the moment. Furthermore, the power of suggestion plays a profound role, as one person's mention of having seen the Vardoger can plant seeds of false memory in the minds of others present, gradually convincing them that they too witnessed this impossible doubling, creating a kind of collective hallucination that strengthens through retelling and shared conviction. The phenomenon also draws strength from the particular psychological state of Nordic communities during long, dark winters, when isolation and reduced light exposure can subtly alter perception and increase susceptibility to patterns of misidentification and memory distortion. Yet despite our understanding of these psychological mechanisms, the Vardoger persists not as a supernatural occurrence, but as a genuine category of human experience, one that continues to be reported by otherwise rational individuals who have no investment in superstition, suggesting that something about the texture of human consciousness itself creates the conditions for these encounters to feel absolutely real to those who experience them. Perhaps what remains most remarkable is not that the Vardoger occurs, but that we have largely normalized its impossibility, accepting that our own minds can convince us of events that never happened while simultaneously remaining mystified by why this particular form of doubling continues to be reported across generations. In recent decades, some researchers have suggested that the Vardoger may also relate to déjà vu's inverse, a kind of temporal displacement where the brain's prediction systems misfire, making us feel that we have already lived through moments we are only now experiencing for the first time, a glitch in consciousness that bridges past and future in ways we're only beginning to understand. What makes the Vardøger uniquely Scandinavian, however, may simply be that these northern cultures developed a name for this universal human quirk, transforming a neurological accident into a folkloric entity, and in doing so, gave shape to something that might otherwise remain nameless and therefore invisible. Bilocation represents one of the most persistent and perplexing phenomena in the landscape of unexplained human experience, wherein an individual is credibly reported to exist in two separate geographical locations simultaneously, not as a matter of metaphor or spiritual abstraction, but as a documented historical account with multiple independent witnesses testifying to having seen the same person in entirely different places at the exact same moment in time. The concept has appeared throughout recorded history across virtually every culture and civilization, from medieval European monasteries, where monks reported seeing their abbots simultaneously presiding over prayers in the chapel while also appearing to work in distant monastery gardens, to indigenous traditions in South America and Australia, where shamans and spiritual leaders were described by multiple reliable observers as manifesting their presence in two locations during crucial ceremonial moments. In the 19th and 20th centuries, documented cases emerged with remarkable specificity and corroboration, including accounts from naval vessels where crew members swore they witnessed officers on deck, while simultaneously receiving reports that those same officers were being treated in the ship's infirmary, separated by several sealed compartments and hundreds of yards of physical space. The mechanisms proposed to explain bilocation operate across multiple theoretical domains, ranging from the neurological and psychological to the quantum and metaphysical, with some researchers suggesting that highly evolved consciousness or intense mental focus might create a kind of perceptual duplicate or projection that becomes sufficiently coherent to register in the sensory awareness of multiple independent observers, essentially suggesting that consciousness itself might possess properties we do not yet understand regarding its relationship to physical space and time. Other theories invoke the possibility of quantum superposition extending to macroscopic biological systems, where under extreme stress or meditative states, the neural correlates of consciousness might enter a kind of probabilistic state, allowing the individual's presence to register in multiple locations until observed, collapsing into classical reality at one specific point. The psychological explanation suggests that witnesses might unconsciously create false memories of bilocation, with their brains filling in details with remarkable consistency across multiple people due to shared cultural expectations and the power of suggestion. Yet this fails to account for the specificity of many documented cases where witnesses were isolated from one another and provided identical details about conversations and specific actions they claimed to witness. What remains most striking is how bilocation persists in human testimony and cultural memory despite having no accepted scientific mechanism and no reproducible laboratory demonstration. Yet we have largely normalized our inability to explain it by simply compartmentalizing these accounts into the realm of folklore and legend, rather than seriously investigating the gap between testimony and our current understanding of human consciousness and physical reality. Perhaps the most intellectually honest approach would be to acknowledge that the consistency and cross-cultural persistence of bilocation accounts suggests either a fundamental gap in our understanding of consciousness and perception, or a deeply ingrained capacity in human neurobiology to generate shared hallucinations that somehow transcends the individual mind, either possibility warranting serious scientific attention rather than dismissal. The fact that bilocation accounts often involve individuals in altered states, deep prayer, meditation, or moments of extreme psychological stress, suggests that whatever mechanism enables such experiences, it may be intimately connected to the plasticity of consciousness itself and our still rudimentary understanding of how subjective experience relates to objective physical presence. In ancient Egypt, there existed a concept so fundamental to their understanding of existence that it permeated every aspect of their civilization, from the grandest monuments to the smallest domestic rituals, and this concept was known as the Ka, a word that has been translated variously as the life force, the double, the spiritual essence, or perhaps most intriguingly, as a kind of parallel self that existed simultaneously with the physical body, yet operated according to entirely different rules and principles. The ancient Egyptians believed that every living being, from the pharaoh seated upon his throne to the humblest peasant working in the fields, possessed not merely a single consciousness or soul, but rather multiple spiritual components. And among these, the Ka held a position of supreme importance, for it was understood to be the vital energy that sustained life itself, the animating principle that distinguished the living from the dead, the breathing from the inanimate. What made this concept particularly fascinating was not merely its existence in their religious philosophy, but rather the practical and material ways in which it shaped Egyptian society, influencing how they built their tombs with elaborate provisions and sustenance, how they created statues and images of the deceased, and how they maintained an entire system of rituals and offerings designed to nourish and sustain the Ka long after the physical body had ceased to function. The Ka was thought to require food and drink, to need companionship and comfort, to deserve respect and remembrance, and this belief operated on a level so deep within Egyptian consciousness that it functioned not as a metaphor or symbolic understanding, but as literal reality, as something as tangible and undeniable as the Nile itself. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears rooted in humanity's fundamental difficulty with accepting the finality of death, a difficulty that manifests across virtually every culture and historical period, yet the Egyptian approach to this universal anxiety took a distinctly elaborate and systematic form, perhaps because Egyptian civilization maintained such remarkable continuity across millennia that their traditions became increasingly entrenched and formalized. The concept of the Ka allowed individuals to imagine a form of continuation after physical death, a parallel existence in which the essential nature of a person persisted and could be sustained through proper ritual and remembrance. And this belief simultaneously addressed multiple deep human needs at once, providing comfort against mortality while also creating a framework through which the living could maintain bonds with the deceased, could feel as though they were actively caring for departed loved ones, could transform grief into purposeful action. Furthermore, the Ka concept reflected an intuitive understanding that identity and consciousness are somehow separate from the physical body, an insight that would not be scientifically articulated until modern neuroscience, yet which the Egyptians grasped intuitively through observation and philosophical reflection, recognizing that personality, memory, and essence seem to transcend mere flesh and bone. Consider the strange experience of becoming aware that your thoughts about your thoughts are themselves thoughts that you are thinking, and how this recursive awareness seems to fold back infinitely, each layer of consciousness observing the layer beneath it in an endless regression that never quite reaches a foundation. This is the phenomenon of fractal consciousness, the troubling recognition that human awareness operates not as a simple linear process, but as a self-similar pattern repeating at every scale, where each iteration of self-reflection contains the same fundamental structure as the whole, creating what feels like an infinite mirror hall of observing selves. In daily life, we experience this most acutely during moments of intense introspection, when we catch ourselves wondering why we are wondering, then becoming aware that we are aware of wondering about our wondering, until the recursive loop becomes almost nauseating in its depth. The mechanism behind this fractal nature appears to operate through the brain's capacity for meta-representation, the ability to create mental models not only of external reality, but of our own mental models themselves. And when this recursive capacity turns inward with sufficient intensity, it generates these self-similar patterns of awareness at every conceivable level of abstraction. Neuroscientific research suggests that our default mode network, the brain system active during rest and self-referential thinking, operates through interconnected hierarchical systems where higher-order regions process information about lower-order regions in ways that fundamentally mirror the structure of those lower regions themselves. What makes fractal consciousness so persistently enigmatic is that we have largely normalized this dizzying recursive structure by simply not dwelling on it, by treating the bottomless regression of self-awareness as a mundane feature of consciousness, rather than the paradoxical impossibility it genuinely appears to be. And we navigate daily life with countless nested layers of self-monitoring and self-observation running simultaneously without ever requiring them to reach any final resting point of pure undivided awareness. Yet perhaps this infinite regression is not a flaw in consciousness, but its essential feature, the very mechanism that allows us to step outside ourselves enough to recognize ourselves at all, to achieve the peculiar human capacity of knowing that we know, even if that knowledge can never collapse into a final unified point of absolute self-transparency. And perhaps this is why the deepest moments of meditation or flow state, where self-monitoring temporarily quiets, feel like relief rather than enlightenment, suggesting that the fractal recursion is less a window into truth and more a cognitive artifact we tolerate in exchange for the self-awareness that makes us fundamentally human. The mathematician caught in an infinite proof, the therapist analyzing their own analysis, the writer describing the act of description itself. All are simply experiencing the fractal structure of consciousness made temporarily visible, a glimpse of the recursive machinery that usually hums invisibly beneath every thought we have about ourselves. And yet in those rare moments, when we manage to step entirely outside this recursive loop, not through meditation's erasure of self, but through genuine absorption in something beyond ourselves, we discover that consciousness need not always fold back upon itself, that the hall of mirrors can briefly dissolve, leaving only the simple clarity of being present to what is, without the exhausting requirement that awareness must always be aware of itself being aware. In such moments, the fractal collapses into something simpler, not unconsciousness, but consciousness without the burden of self-witnessing, a state so rare and precious that we spend much of our reflective lives chasing its memory, only to find that the very act of trying to recapture it through recursive thought reconstructs the infinite hall we sought to escape. Imagine standing at the edge of an infinite cosmic foam, where each bubble represents an entirely separate universe, complete with its own laws of physics, its own constants, and its own version of reality that may be fundamentally incompatible with our own. The bubble universe theory emerges from the mathematics of cosmic inflation, that period in the earliest moments after the Big Bang when space itself expanded at an exponential rate. And what physicists have come to realize is that this inflation may never have actually stopped everywhere at once. Instead, in some regions of space, inflation continues eternally, perpetually generating new bubbles of universe, each one nucleating out of the quantum foam like bubbles rising through champagne, each one isolated from all the others by the stretching expansion of space itself, unable to communicate or interact with neighboring universes because the expanding space between them grows faster than light could ever travel. In our particular bubble, our specific universe, the inflation ended billions of years ago, allowing matter and energy to cool and coalesce into galaxies and stars, and eventually conscious beings capable of wondering about their own origins. But in the infinite foam around us, countless other bubbles continue to inflate and cool and populate themselves with their own forms of matter and their own variations on physical law. Universes where perhaps the strength of gravity differs from ours, or where the electron has a different mass, or where the fundamental constants of nature are tuned in such a way that no stars could ever form. Or perhaps universes where the variations are so extreme that nothing we would recognize as matter or energy could exist at all. The mechanism behind this proliferation of parallel universes lies in the quantum nature of inflation itself, in the probabilistic uncertainty that governs all quantum processes, including the process by which inflation ends in any given region of space. Because inflation is fundamentally quantum mechanical, it does not end everywhere at precisely the same moment through any uniform classical mechanism, but rather it terminates in different places at different times based on quantum tunneling events and probability fluctuations. And as soon as inflation ends in one region and a universe bubble forms, the remaining inflating space continues to generate more bubbles eternally, each one carrying forward its own set of randomly determined physical constants that emerge from the underlying quantum fields. This theory has persisted and even gained credibility despite its profound unfalsifiability, despite the fact that by definition we can never observe these other bubbles directly since they are forever causally disconnected from our own, and despite the possibility that an infinite number of such universes might exist and never leave any testable trace of their existence upon our own reality. What draws physicists to this idea is that it emerges naturally and almost inevitably from the mathematics of inflation theory, not as an add-on or speculative extension, but as the essential consequence of taking the equations seriously in their fullest form. And so the bubble universe framework has become embedded in contemporary cosmology as a kind of almost expected landscape of possibilities. A strange acceptance that our universe may be one small pocket in an incomprehensibly vast and eternal cosmic structure, where almost anything that can occur does occur somewhere in the infinite foam, and where we inhabit merely one particular bubble among countless trillions, perhaps among infinities, of other universes with their own histories and their own laws and their own sleeping observers who contemplate the same questions about their place in the cosmos. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of the dream life, that sustained and often elaborate narrative existence that unfolds each night as consciousness surrenders to sleep. A parallel existence so vivid and emotionally resonant that upon waking we find ourselves briefly unable to distinguish which life holds greater authenticity, the one we lived in dream or the one we inhabit in daylight. In these nocturnal hours, we inhabit alternate versions of ourselves navigating through scenarios that feel entirely coherent in the moment, complete with genuine relationships, consequences, and emotional weight, where we might be different ages, possess different relationships, live in different cities, or occupy entirely different social positions than we do during our waking existence. We make decisions in these dream lives that feel consequential. We experience joy and sorrow and confusion. We encounter versions of people we know behaving in unexpected ways, and we move through environments both familiar and impossible. Yet somehow the logic of the dream sustains itself throughout the night without questioning its own contradictions. The mechanism behind this phenomenon rests fundamentally on the unique neurological state of sleep, where the prefrontal cortex, responsible for logical evaluation and reality testing, significantly reduces its activity, while the limbic system and visual cortex remain highly engaged, allowing emotional content and visual imagery to flourish unchecked by rational scrutiny. During REM sleep particularly, the brain generates electrical activity patterns similar to waking consciousness. Yet without the input of sensory reality, it constructs entire worlds from memory fragments, emotional associations, and random neural firing, creating narratives that feel authentic precisely because they engage the same emotional and narrative centers that make waking life feel real. The dream life persists with such conviction because within the dream state, we have no access to the cognitive tools that would normally allow us to question its legitimacy, no opportunity to compare it against consensual reality, and no time to notice the logical impossibilities until we awaken, at which point the dream often fades with remarkable speed, leaving only fragments and emotional residue. Yet what remains enigmatic is how thoroughly we accept these alternate lives while inhabiting them, how completely we suspend disbelief in scenarios involving flying or breathing underwater or conversing with deceased relatives, and how the emotional authenticity of a dream interaction with a loved one can feel as meaningful as a waking one, suggesting that perhaps our sense of reality depends less on logical consistency than on emotional engagement and narrative coherence. We have largely normalized this nightly bifurcation of existence, treating dreams as mere psychological phenomena rather than genuinely parallel experiences. Yet we continue to report that our dream lives feel undeniably real in the moment, that they can shift our mood upon waking, that they sometimes seem to offer insight or resolution to waking problems, and that they constitute a substantial portion of our lived experience, even if we have collectively decided to consider them less important, less authentic, and less worthy of attention than the lives we live with open eyes. Yet perhaps this dismissal itself reveals something telling, that we fear what the existence of dream lives implies about the nature of consciousness itself, that if an alternate life can feel entirely convincing without external validation, then the certainty we feel about our waking life may rest on nothing more substantial than habit and consensus. A thought so unsettling that we prefer to relegate our nightly existences to the category of mere fantasy, as though calling them only dreams could somehow diminish their claim on what we consider real. Consider the peculiar phenomenon where a single human being exists simultaneously in multiple distinct states of identity, each one fully functional and internally consistent, yet operating without explicit awareness of the others until some triggering event forces a collision between these parallel versions of self. This is not a matter of deliberate deception or conscious role-playing in the traditional sense, but rather something far more subtle and pervasive, a kind of quantum-like uncertainty applied to human consciousness, where the act of being observed in one context seems to collapse the person into a specific version, while in another context an entirely different version emerges as if the previous one never existed at all. The professional self who navigates corporate hierarchies with precise language and calculated emotional restraint transforms utterly when alone with family, becoming warm and unguarded and prone to rambling stories that would never emerge in the boardroom. And yet when this person attends a university reunion, they become something else again, a nostalgic version haunted by old ambitions and friendships. And none of these selves feel fraudulent from the inside, because each one is genuinely experiencing its reality as complete and authentic in that moment. The mechanism operates through what might be called contextual collapse, wherein the brain instantaneously recognizes environmental and social cues that activate specific neural patterns and behavioral protocols, almost like different operating systems being loaded onto the same hardware, and the person experiences this not as switching, but as simply being themselves, because in that context they are their genuine, authentic self, shaped by who they are with and where they are and what is expected of them. This phenomenon persists so thoroughly in human experience that we have developed an entire linguistic framework around it, speaking casually of putting on masks or shifting gears or being different people in different spaces, treating it as an unremarkable fact of life rather than the profound metaphysical puzzle it actually represents, and we accept without examination that we might tell a close friend something we would never tell a colleague, or behave with our parents in ways that would horrify our own children, or present ourselves to strangers in ways we would find absurd if exposed to our intimate partners, all while maintaining a coherent sense of identity that somehow encompasses all these contradictory manifestations simultaneously. The crisis emerges only when these contexts collide unexpectedly, when a colleague encounters you in your family role, or a parent witnesses your professional persona, or social media collapses the carefully maintained distance between your various audiences. And suddenly the unified self shatters into visible contradiction, forcing an uncomfortable reckoning with the question of which version, if any, represents the real you, or whether the real you is simply the capacity to be all of them seamlessly. Perhaps the most unsettling recognition is that these superposed selves are not illusions concealing some bedrock authentic core beneath. Rather, they constitute the totality of what you are, and the anxiety we feel when contexts collide comes not from being exposed as fraudulent, but from the sudden visibility of a multiplicity we normally experience as seamless singularity, forcing us to confront that identity itself may be less a fixed entity than an ongoing performance of contextual coherence that only feels like truth because we are always, necessarily, performing it alone. The relief we feel in solitude is not the relief of dropping a mask to reveal our true self, but rather the relief of ceasing to perform the act of integration itself, of no longer needing to maintain the exhausting fiction that all these versions cohere into a single consistent entity. And in that privacy, we are free to be genuinely fragmented, to contradict ourselves without apology, because there is no audience requiring us to be coherent. Consider the person who experiences what they describe as a profound sense of familiarity upon encountering a complete stranger, a fleeting moment where the boundary between past and present seems to dissolve into something ineffable and unnamed, and who finds themselves wondering if perhaps they have known this person in some previous existence, in some other life lived across the vast expanse of time. This sensation of déjà vu, of recognition without memory, of connection without explanation, has prompted countless individuals throughout history to entertain the possibility that their consciousness might have inhabited other bodies, other minds, other lives, in distant epochs and alternate incarnations, a belief system known as metempsychosis or transmigration of the soul. The ancient Pythagoreans spoke of this phenomenon with conviction, suggesting that the soul moved from body to body in an endless cycle, and the concept flourished across Hindu, Buddhist, and Platonic traditions, each offering their own cosmological frameworks for understanding how consciousness could persist beyond the death of the physical form. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears rooted in our mind's natural tendency to seek patterns and connections, to find meaning in coincidence and familiarity in the unfamiliar. For when we encounter something that triggers an intuitive sense of knowing without conscious memory to support it, we experience a genuine cognitive and emotional phenomenon that demands explanation. Our brains are pattern recognition machines operating with incomplete information about the world and ourselves, and when the normal processes of memory and association cannot readily explain a sensation of recognition, the imagination fills the gaps with narratives that feel intuitively plausible and deeply resonant. The concept of metempsychosis offered ancient peoples a comprehensive answer to fundamental questions about identity, continuity, and the nature of consciousness itself. Questions that remain largely unresolved by modern neuroscience despite our advances in understanding brain function. What remains remarkable is how persistently this idea survives in contemporary consciousness, how millions of individuals in the modern age continue to report experiences they interpret as memories from past lives, how therapists and spiritual practitioners continue to facilitate regressions into supposed previous incarnations, and how these narratives feel compellingly real to those who experience them, suggesting that the human need to believe in the continuity and transcendence of self remains as powerful in our scientific age as it was in antiquity. We have normalized the acceptance of past life experiences as genuine psychological phenomena worthy of serious consideration, even as we lack any mechanism by which consciousness could transfer between bodies, even as we have found no evidence that such a transfer ever occurs, and even as we know that human memory is unreliable, suggestible, and prone to reconstruction of narratives that feel true despite bearing little resemblance to actual events. The belief persists because it addresses something fundamental within human nature, something that our rational, materialist understanding of consciousness cannot quite satisfy. Perhaps this is because the alternative, that consciousness simply ceases, that the self dissolves entirely into nothingness, that our accumulated experiences and identity vanish without trace or continuation, remains psychologically intolerable for most minds, making the comforting mythology of eternal recurrence far more appealing than the austere finality that materialism insists upon. Yet in clinging to this mythology, we reveal not a flaw in human reasoning, but perhaps a wisdom that our current frameworks have not yet encompassed, an intuitive recognition that identity and consciousness may be far more fluid, interconnected, and continuous with the rest of existence than our rigid categories of self and other have allowed us to imagine. Consider the experience of a person who feels fundamentally displaced in their own life, as though they are observing their existence from a distance rather than truly inhabiting it, moving through their days with a persistent sense that they belong elsewhere, in some other version of themselves that exists in parallel to this current iteration, a phenomenon that manifests as a deep restlessness that no amount of achievement or relocation or relationship seems capable of satisfying. And this individual may spend years chasing what they believe to be their authentic life, moving from city to city, changing careers repeatedly, abandoning relationships that once felt promising, always operating under the conviction that the real version of them, the version that was meant to exist, is waiting to be discovered somewhere beyond the horizon of their current reality. The psychological mechanism underlying this experience appears rooted in a fundamental disconnect between the self that makes decisions and the self that observes those decisions being made, a fragmentation that might develop in response to early experiences of instability or emotional neglect, where the psyche learned to maintain distance from its own lived experience as a protective strategy, creating layers of separation between the conscious mind and the body it inhabits. Between intention and action, leaving the person perpetually in a state of searching for the version of themselves that feels real, that feels like home. What persists despite our modern understanding of psychology and neurology is the stubborn cultural narrative that validates this wandering impulse as something noble or spiritually significant, the romanticization of the eternal seeker, the soul in transit, when in fact the wandering often represents a profound dissociation from presence itself. Yet we have constructed entire industries and artistic traditions around this displacement, celebrating the restless spirit and the nomadic heart. Normalizing the sensation of being a ghost in one's own life by reframing it as depth of character or spiritual sophistication. And in doing so we perpetuate the very dissociation that causes suffering, suggesting to those who experience this alienation from their own existence that they are simply not yet in the right place, that the solution lies in more movement, more change, more distance from where they currently stand, when perhaps the actual path forward requires the opposite impulse entirely. The work of returning, of learning to inhabit one's own life fully, to recognize that home is not a destination but a practice of presence, requires a kind of courage that our culture rarely acknowledges, a willingness to stop running and instead turn toward the very discomfort that initially prompted the flight. This turning toward requires sitting with the anxiety that arises when one stops moving, recognizing that the persistent sense of displacement was never actually solved by geography, but only temporarily numbed by the stimulation of novelty and transition, and discovering that the authentic self one was always seeking was present all along, waiting not in some distant location, but in the willingness to be fully present to this moment, this body. This particular life with all its perceived ordinariness and limitation. And perhaps the greatest irony is that this homecoming, this radical acceptance of where one already stands, often produces the very sense of belonging and aliveness that years of wandering never could, a paradox that suggests the soul was never truly lost, only estranged from itself through the habit of perpetual departure. The person who has made this homecoming often reports not that their circumstances have dramatically changed, but that their relationship to their circumstances has fundamentally shifted. The same apartment becomes a sanctuary, the same job becomes meaningful, the same people become truly seen, suggesting that the wandering soul was always searching for something that could only be found through stopping, through the simple but devastating act of saying, "I am here, and this is enough." Consider the phenomenon that occurs when a group of people separated by vast distances and without any means of direct communication somehow arrive at identical solutions to problems they have never encountered before. Or when members of a species develop new behaviors that spread through the population despite no apparent mechanism for transmission of this information. The British biologist Rupert Sheldrake proposed in the 1980s that living organisms are organized by morphic fields, invisible organizing principles that carry information across space and time, allowing creatures to inherit not just genetic material, but also learned behaviors and patterns of thought from their species and their evolutionary past. This theory suggests that when one member of a species learns something new, that knowledge somehow becomes more accessible to other members of the same species around the world, a phenomenon he called morphic resonance, wherein organisms throughout a population literally resonate with the patterns established by others who came before them or exist alongside them in the present moment. The mechanism proposed suggests that these fields are not material in nature, but rather represent a kind of non-local connection between all living things, a realm of information that exists beyond the boundaries of individual organisms, and allows for a kind of telepathic transfer of knowledge and behavioral patterns that defies conventional understanding of how information travels through space. What makes this theory particularly compelling is that it attempts to explain observations that have puzzled scientists for centuries, such as how rats in separated laboratories suddenly learned the same new skills at approximately the same time, or how entire populations of birds shifted their migration patterns in synchronized ways that seem to require some form of shared knowledge or collective intention. The psychological appeal of morphic resonance lies in its suggestion that we are all fundamentally connected to something larger than ourselves, that our individual discoveries and insights somehow ripple outward to affect the consciousness of others, and that the boundaries between self and other are perhaps far more permeable than our materialist understanding of biology has suggested. Yet despite the lack of empirical support from conventional science, despite the absence of a demonstrated physical mechanism that could explain how such information could travel without any known medium or force, the idea persists in the collective imagination, suggesting that we remain deeply drawn to the notion that consciousness and knowledge operate according to principles that transcend the merely physical. And that somewhere beneath the surface of measurable reality lies a realm of connection and resonance that unites all living things in ways we have yet to fully comprehend or explain through our current scientific frameworks. Whether this yearning reflects a genuine gap in our scientific understanding or represents a deeply human need to feel part of something transcendent remains one of the great open questions of our time, one that morphic resonance continues to embody as a bridge between empiricism and intuition, between the measurable and the mysteriously interconnected. Perhaps most intriguingly, morphic resonance suggests that this very act of contemplating the theory itself, of millions of minds across the globe pondering the same questions about connection and consciousness, might be strengthening the field itself, making the idea more real through collective attention, a recursive loop wherein belief and reality become increasingly difficult to distinguish. If this recursive strengthening is real, then the very skepticism directed at morphic resonance, the intense scrutiny, the repeated discussions, the ongoing cultural fascination despite scientific dismissal, might paradoxically serve to reinforce the phenomenon itself, transforming doubt into a form of engagement that feeds the field rather than diminishes it. Consider the curious phenomenon of the echo self, that strange experience where you encounter someone who bears such an uncanny resemblance to yourself that observers pause, comment, and sometimes even question whether they are witnessing the same person in two places at once. This person walks with a gait similar to yours, speaks with inflections that mirror your own speech patterns, carries themselves with a posture that echoes your habitual stance, and possesses facial features that seem like a variation played in a minor key rather than a completely different melody. You might cross paths in a crowded city street, or hear about this person through friends and acquaintances, or discover them through the curious pathways of social media where algorithms now facilitate these recognitions with unprecedented efficiency. The experience itself creates a peculiar dissonance in the mind, a sense that there exists a parallel rendering of yourself walking through the world, making choices in real time, accumulating experiences that diverge only slightly from your own trajectory. This phenomenon has become increasingly documented in the modern era, with websites dedicated to matching strangers who possess these striking similarities, and with countless stories of people meeting their supposed doubles and finding the encounter both delightful and deeply unsettling. The psychological mechanism underlying this experience operates through several interconnected processes that our minds employ constantly. The human brain is exquisitely attuned to pattern recognition, having evolved over millennia to detect faces, forms, and familiar configurations within our environment with remarkable speed and sensitivity. When we encounter someone who shares even a subset of our distinguishing characteristics, our pattern recognition system activates in a particular way, creating a sense of recognition that feels almost involuntary. We are simultaneously drawn to and repelled by this recognition because it violates a fundamental assumption we hold about identity itself, namely that we are unique, irreplaceable, singular in our particularity. Additionally, confirmation bias plays a significant role in these encounters, as once we have noticed one similarity between ourselves and another person, we begin to actively search for additional confirmations of this resemblance, unconsciously filtering out the numerous ways in which we differ. The statistical reality is that among billions of human beings, certain combinations of features must inevitably repeat, and the probability of encountering someone who shares a meaningful subset of our characteristics is far higher than our intuitions typically allow us to estimate. Yet despite understanding the mechanical explanation for why echo selves exist and why we notice them, the experience retains a peculiar power over our imagination and our sense of self. We have normalized the concept intellectually while remaining emotionally resistant to it, accepting the premise that such doubles exist while simultaneously harboring the irrational hope that we remain singular and unrepeatable. This paradox persists in our culture through countless stories, films, and narratives that treat the doppelganger with a mixture of philosophical curiosity and existential dread. We document these encounters obsessively on social media, as though the act of sharing evidence of our echo self somehow authenticates our own existence and renders the duplicate less threatening by making it visible and communal rather than private and strange. The echo self ultimately challenges a deeply held belief about the nature of human identity and individuality, forcing us to confront the possibility that what we experience as utterly unique and irreplaceable might actually be one variation among countless similar patterns. And this confrontation occurs in the quiet moments of recognition when we see ourselves reflected imperfectly in another person's face. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of human symbolism across cultures that have never made contact with one another, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, yet arriving at remarkably similar representations of meaning, mythology, and archetypal imagery that seem to emerge from some shared reservoir of human experience. The serpent appears as a symbol of wisdom and renewal in ancient Mesoamerica, just as it does in Asian philosophy and European folklore. The hero's journey manifests in the stories of disparate civilizations from Japan to Greece to the Americas, and certain geometric patterns and color associations repeat themselves with such consistency that we find ourselves wondering whether there exists some deeper layer of consciousness that transcends individual minds and personal experience. Carl Jung proposed precisely this idea when he articulated the concept of the collective unconscious, suggesting that beneath the personal unconscious of each individual, there exists a deeper stratum of the psyche that contains universal archetypes, primordial images, and inherited psychological patterns that belong not to any one person but to humanity as a whole, accumulated across generations and encoded into the very fabric of human consciousness itself. The mechanism operates somewhat like a vast psychological inheritance passed down not through genes, but through the symbolic structures of culture, language, myth, and story, where certain images and patterns become so deeply embedded in human consciousness through repeated expression and universal human experience that they acquire an almost instinctive quality, emerging spontaneously in art, dreams, religion, and creative expression without any deliberate transmission of information. What makes this concept so enigmatic is that it persists as a compelling framework for understanding human behavior and creativity, despite the fact that it remains scientifically problematic and difficult to verify through conventional empirical methods. Yet the evidence continues to accumulate in the form of cross-cultural studies, dream analysis, and artistic expression, leading us to continue examining whether there truly exists some transpersonal dimension of consciousness that connects all human beings to a shared psychological inheritance that shapes how we perceive reality, express meaning, and navigate the fundamental mysteries of existence and death. Perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that the collective unconscious represents not a mystical entity, but rather the accumulated psychological wisdom of our species, encoded in the universal patterns of human development, trauma, love, and mortality that every consciousness must inevitably encounter and process, suggesting that what we interpret as archetypal symbols may ultimately be the human mind recognizing itself across time. In this reading, the mother archetype that appears in countless mythologies, the nurturing creator, the devouring force, the eternal womb, becomes not a supernatural blueprint, but rather the internalized psychological reality of human birth and dependency that every consciousness experiences, a pattern so fundamental to our species that it echoes through every culture's stories and symbols as a recognition of shared embodied existence. Similarly, the shadow archetype, a repository of rejected, repressed, and socially unacceptable aspects of self, emerges universally in mythology as the demon, the trickster, or the dark double, suggesting that the collective unconscious may ultimately be less a mystical inheritance than a mirror reflecting the universal psychological structures that every human mind must necessarily construct in order to develop, integrate experience, and navigate the perpetual tension between individual desire and social belonging. Consider the moment when a person loses their sense of self entirely, when the boundaries that define who they believe themselves to be dissolve into something boundless and undifferentiated, a state in which the narrative they have constructed about their own identity simply ceases to function as it once did. And in this dissolution, there exists a profound paradox that has fascinated both ancient mystics and contemporary neuroscientists alike. For how can consciousness experience the absence of the self that is doing the experiencing? And yet individuals who have undergone such profound alterations report with striking consistency that the experience was undeniably real and transformative in ways that ordinary waking consciousness seems incapable of achieving. The mechanism behind ego death appears to involve a fundamental disruption of the default mode network in the brain, that interconnected system of neural regions responsible for self-referential thinking and the continuous generation of the autobiographical narrative we mistake for our essential nature. And when this network falls silent or becomes fragmented, the usual filtering mechanisms that organize reality into the neat categories of self and other, subject and object, desirable and undesirable, simply stop functioning in their habitual way, leaving consciousness to encounter itself without the protective scaffolding of identity that normally structures perception and meaning. This state can be induced through various pathways, whether through intensive meditation practices sustained over years, through certain psychoactive compounds that alter neurochemical balance, through extreme physical or emotional trauma that shatters the ego's defensive architecture, or through spontaneous mystical experiences that arise without any deliberate invitation. And in each case, there seems to be a moment where the person realizes with startling clarity that the self they have spent their entire life defending and promoting and worrying about protecting is not actually a fixed entity, but rather a temporary construction, a useful fiction maintained by continuous mental effort, a story that the brain tells itself moment to moment to create the illusion of continuity and control. Yet despite the logical implications of such experiences, despite the fact that countless individuals across cultures and centuries have reported ego death states and emerged describing a dissolution of the fear-based patterns that ego maintains, we continue to organize our societies and our personal lives around the reinforcement of ego, the protection and expansion of individual identity. The accumulation of possessions and status and recognition as if this were the ultimate purpose of existence, and this curious persistence of ego-centered living even among those who have glimpsed its illusory nature suggests something profound about the human condition, that perhaps the ego's death is temporary, that the constructed self reassembles itself with remarkable speed and efficiency once the conditions that dissolved it have passed. That consciousness may be capable of experiencing its own absence, and yet still find itself drawn back to the comforting narrative of separation and individuality, as though the ego-death experience, however transformative and enlightening it may seem in the moment, cannot permanently alter the brain's fundamental operating system, the one that says you are separate, you are in danger, you must survive and succeed and be remembered. Yet perhaps this is not a failure, but rather an indication that ego-death, in its most valuable form, is not meant to be permanent, that the gift of such experiences lies not in remaining dissolved, but in returning to ordinary consciousness carrying the memory of dissolution, like someone who has glimpsed behind the curtain and can never quite believe in the stage props in the same way again, even as they continue to navigate the theater. In the theoretical landscape of modern physics, there exists a concept known as membrane universes, or branes, which proposes that our observable reality might exist upon a thin, multidimensional surface floating within a vast higher-dimensional space, much like how a two-dimensional creature might live on the surface of a sheet of paper suspended in three-dimensional room without ever perceiving the space beyond its membrane. This framework emerged from string theory, which suggests that fundamental particles are not point-like objects, but rather vibrating strings, and these strings exist within a universe that contains far more spatial dimensions than the three we can directly perceive. The membrane universe theory further proposes that there could be countless parallel universes, each existing as separate membranes or branes floating in this higher dimensional bulk space, occasionally interacting with one another through gravity or other forces, creating a multiverse where our universe is merely one layer among infinite others. The psychological appeal of this idea lies partly in how it transforms our intuitive sense of cosmic insignificance into something almost poetic. If we truly are living on a membrane in higher dimensional space, then every moment of our existence becomes a whisper on the surface of an incomprehensibly vast structure. What makes this concept particularly enigmatic is that despite being grounded in rigorous mathematical formalism and peer-reviewed research, it remains almost entirely beyond our current technological capacity to verify or falsify, creating a strange intellectual space where scientific legitimacy coexists with unfalsifiable speculation. We have normalized this uncertainty because the mathematics underlying membrane universes is coherent and elegant, yet we simultaneously acknowledge that we might never develop the tools to test such theories, leading us to accept them as intellectually respectable possibilities rather than established facts. The membrane universe theory persists in scientific discourse not because evidence supports it, but because it represents one of the few frameworks that attempts to reconcile quantum mechanics with general relativity while simultaneously explaining why gravity appears so much weaker than other fundamental forces, suggesting that gravitational effects might leak between membranes or propagate through the higher dimensional bulk space. This speculation has become woven into the fabric of theoretical physics precisely because it addresses genuine puzzles about the nature of reality, yet it exists in a peculiar state where academic credibility and profound uncertainty coexist, where scientists discuss membrane universes in published papers while privately acknowledging that we may never know whether such structures truly exist or whether our universe rests upon such an exotic foundation. Perhaps this is why membrane universes have captured the imagination of physicists and the public alike. They represent a frontier where the boundaries between rigorous science and inspired conjecture blur into something neither wholly one nor the other, a reminder that our greatest intellectual achievements often emerge not from certainty, but from the productive tension between mathematical elegance and empirical humility. In this sense, membrane universes join a long tradition of scientific ideas, from atomic structure to black holes, that began as mathematical abstractions before gradually accumulating empirical support, yet they also serve as a cautionary tale about the limits of human knowledge, reminding us that some questions about the fundamental architecture of existence may ultimately transcend the boundaries of what any finite civilization could ever hope to measure or prove. Yet even in this epistemic humility, the membrane universe framework has already altered how we think about fundamental reality, inspiring new mathematical tools and generating unexpected connections between string theory, cosmology, and quantum gravity that might prove valuable regardless of whether branes themselves are ultimately real. Imagine standing at the edge of infinity, watching the universe breathe in rhythmic cycles, where the beginning and the end are not linear points on a timeline, but rather moments that eternally return to themselves, creating patterns of existence that repeat across eons in ways both identical and subtly transformed. Cyclic cosmology proposes that our universe does not expand infinitely toward a cold, dark heat death, nor does it originate from a singular moment of creation that occurred once and only once, but rather undergoes infinite cycles of expansion and contraction, where each universe gives birth to the next through mechanisms that defy our conventional understanding of causality and temporality. This theory suggests that what we perceive as the Big Bang may actually be the latest iteration in an endless sequence of cosmic renewals, where universes are born from the collapse of their predecessors, inheriting physical constants and fundamental properties that echo through the fabric of reality like ripples propagating across an infinite ocean. The mechanism underlying this concept involves the observation that if matter and energy can be neither created nor destroyed, but only transformed, then the universe itself might operate according to similar laws, where the apparent finality of endings becomes merely a transition point toward new beginnings, and the entropy that supposedly leads to universal death instead becomes the catalyst for rebirth and renewal. Physicists and cosmologists have proposed various mathematical frameworks to support these ideas, including Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmology, which suggests that the infinitely distant future of one universe mathematically resembles the initial conditions of another, creating a seamless transition across boundaries that would otherwise seem absolute and insurmountable. What makes cyclic cosmology particularly compelling is how it transforms our deepest anxieties about existence into something more palatable and perhaps even comforting, replacing the terror of absolute endings with the promise of eternal return. Yet we continue to live as though the linear timeline is the only meaningful way to conceive of our cosmic destiny, despite the elegance and philosophical appeal of infinite cycles that suggest our universe participates in a grand eternal pattern. Perhaps this disconnect between what we theorize and how we live reveals something profound, that even if the universe truly cycles through infinite iterations, each moment within a single cycle possesses irreducible meaning and urgency, suggesting that the comfort of eternal return need not diminish our reverence for the present instant, which may itself be the only cosmos that matters to those consciousness inhabiting it. In this view, the universe need not choose between being eternal and being precious. It can be both simultaneously, much as a musical phrase achieves its beauty not from existing only once, but from the possibility of infinite repetition, where each performance carries the full weight of genuine occurrence. We are then neither insignificant specks in an indifferent cosmos nor the sole witnesses to unique creation, but rather participants in a rhythm so vast and profound that our individual lives resonate as necessary notes within an infinite symphony that has always been playing and will always play on. And perhaps what gives this cosmic symphony its deepest meaning is that each universe within the cycle contains within itself the potential to generate consciousness capable of contemplating its own existence, suggesting that the universe's eternal return is not merely a mechanical process, but a continuous recreation of the very conditions necessary for meaning-making itself, where awareness emerges not once but infinitely, each time discovering anew the wonder of existing within a cosmos that remembers and renews itself across the boundaries of time. Consider the experience of a woman who encounters a stranger on a crowded train platform, and in that brief moment of eye contact, feels an inexplicable familiarity, as though she has known this person across multiple lifetimes, a sensation so vivid and overwhelming that it persists in her memory for years afterward, shaping how she approaches relationships and decisions in ways she cannot fully articulate or justify to others who ask her to explain the source of such certainty. The theory of karmic threads suggests that certain individuals are bound together across parallel lives through invisible connections forged by actions, debts, and emotional resonances accumulated across infinite iterations of existence, and that these threads occasionally become visible or tangible in moments of profound synchronicity, when the boundaries between one life and another grow thin enough for recognition to occur. The mechanism by which this might function relies on the concept that consciousness is not confined to a single linear timeline, but rather exists simultaneously across multiple dimensional planes, each containing different versions of the same souls encountering one another in different circumstances, different bodies, different eras, and that these concurrent existences create harmonic frequencies that can occasionally resonate with one another, allowing brief moments of cross-dimensional awareness. Within this framework, a chance encounter becomes not chance at all, but rather the culmination of deliberate paths that were set in motion eons ago, and every meaningful relationship, every inexplicable attraction, every conflict that feels larger than its surface circumstances, represents a karmic thread being drawn taut across the fabric of multiple realities simultaneously. Yet what persists most intriguingly is how normalized this concept has become within contemporary spirituality despite existing entirely outside the realm of measurable, testable, or reproducible evidence, and how readily individuals accept the idea that their lives are predetermined by invisible supernatural debts, rather than by the accumulation of conscious choices made in this present moment. Suggesting that perhaps the human mind requires some framework of cosmic interconnectedness to feel less alone in an increasingly fragmented world, and that the belief in karmic threads may serve a psychological function more profound than its metaphysical accuracy, allowing people to recontextualize random encounters as meaningful and to transform ordinary human connection into something transcendent and eternally significant. This reframing of coincidence as cosmic destiny offers a compelling alternative to the existential vertigo of true randomness, transforming the anxiety of meaninglessness into the comfort of hidden purpose, even if that comfort rests upon unfalsifiable claims about the nature of consciousness and the structure of reality itself. And perhaps this is not a weakness of the belief system, but rather its greatest strength, that a framework which cannot be disproven through empirical means becomes infinitely adaptable to the contours of individual experience, allowing each person to construct their own mythology of connection while remaining perpetually insulated from the contradiction between subjective certainty and objective verification. In this way, the woman on the train platform need never resolve the paradox between her felt sense of recognition and the absence of any rational explanation for it. The unfalsifiability of karmic threads becomes not a logical flaw but a feature, permitting her to honor both the intensity of her intuition and the silence of empirical science, creating a both-and narrative rather than demanding the uncomfortable either-or that characterizes most claims about how reality actually functions. Consider the phenomenon of the silver cord, a concept that has persisted across centuries of spiritual and metaphysical traditions, describing an invisible energetic tether that allegedly connects the physical body to the soul or astral body during moments of out-of-body experience or sleep. Many individuals report during deep meditative states or lucid dreaming episodes that they sense a luminous, thread-like cord of silver or white light extending from their physical form, anchoring their consciousness to their body and preventing them from drifting too far into non-physical realms. These accounts describe the cord as infinitely elastic, capable of stretching across vast distances, yet somehow maintaining an unbreakable connection that ensures the consciousness can always find its way back to physical incarnation. People who claim to experience astral projection report that when they attempt to venture too far from their sleeping body, they feel a gentle or sometimes forceful pull from this cord, drawing them back to wakefulness and reintegration with their physical form. The cord is often described as glowing with an ethereal light, pulsing with the rhythm of the heartbeat, and visible only to those in altered states of consciousness, where the boundary between physical and non-physical perception becomes permeable and malleable. The psychological mechanism underlying this widespread experience relates to the body's fundamental need to maintain a sense of anchoring and orientation within three-dimensional space. The brain, when deprived of normal sensory input during sleep or deep meditation, constructs metaphorical explanations for the disoriented sensation of consciousness without clear spatial reference. What neuroscience describes as the brain's default mode network misfiring is instead narrativized as an energetic cord, a story that the conscious mind can comprehend and integrate. The cord serves as a psychological safeguard against the existential terror of complete dissociation or ego death, providing reassurance that one's identity remains tethered to something permanent and recognizable. Furthermore, the image of a silver cord perfectly embodies the paradox that meditation and altered states present, being both a connection and a separation simultaneously, a lifeline and a leash, belonging to the same metaphorical language that consciousness has always used to describe the ineffable. What remains striking is how persistently this imagery resurfaces across completely unrelated cultures and time periods, from Tibetan Buddhist descriptions of consciousness leaving the body at death, to medieval European accounts of saints experiencing heavenly visions while remaining attached to their earthly vessels. This consistency suggests something deeper than mere psychological projection, yet simultaneously, we have normalized the absence of any measurable or physical evidence of this chord's existence, treating it as real within the context of subjective experience while maintaining skepticism about its objective nature. Silver chord continues to fascinate those seeking to reconcile their experiences of non-ordinary consciousness with frameworks that preserve both rationality and wonder, creating a space where the mysterious can coexist with the mundane. In this liminal space, the silver chord becomes less a literal anatomical feature and more a linguistic bridge, a way of speaking about the essentially unspeakable experience of consciousness observing itself from outside the usual constraints of embodied perspective. Whether the chord exists in any material sense may ultimately matter less than what its persistence across human experience reveals about our species' enduring need to imagine continuity, safety, and return even in our most radically disorienting moments. Imagine walking through your day and encountering a version of yourself that exists only in the spaces between your conscious choices, a parallel self that makes all the decisions you did not make, that takes all the paths you abandoned at the moment of selection, and lives out all the consequences of those rejected alternatives in a realm that mirrors our own but diverges at every critical juncture. This is the concept of shadow lives, the theoretical existence of parallel versions of ourselves that branch away whenever we make a significant choice, each one experiencing a complete and valid existence in a dimension adjacent to our own, unaware of our reality just as we remain unaware of theirs. The idea emerges from a profound observation about human consciousness and decision-making, suggesting that every meaningful choice creates a fork in the road where both paths are traveled simultaneously, not metaphorically but quite literally, with one version of us experiencing the chosen outcome while another version experiences the rejected one with equal authenticity and subjective reality. The psychological mechanism underlying this concept relates to how we experience decision paralysis and existential regret, how we remain haunted by the roads not taken, by the relationships we did not pursue, the careers we abandoned, the cities we chose not to move to, and the words we left unspoken in critical moments. Our minds generate elaborate counterfactual narratives automatically and involuntarily, creating vivid mental simulations of alternative outcomes, alternative versions of ourselves living alternative lives, and these mental constructs feel so real, so vivid, so emotionally resonant that they begin to feel like they might exist somewhere, in some form, experiencing all the joys and sorrows we can imagine but will never know. The shadow life theory suggests that perhaps they do exist, that consciousness itself might be non-local in ways we do not yet understand, that every potential version of ourselves branches into actual existence the moment we make a choice, and that somewhere in the topology of reality, all these parallel selves are living out their parallel lives with complete phenomenological validity. What makes this concept particularly compelling is how it addresses the fundamental human anxiety about choice itself, the way we are haunted by the permanent nature of decisions, the way closing one door means accepting that we will never fully know what lay beyond it, and how this creates a persistent, low-level existential dread that accompanies most major life decisions. We normalize this dread by incorporating it into our narratives about growth and maturity. We tell ourselves that choosing one path means accepting loss, that commitment requires sacrifice, that every yes is also a no, and we frame this as wisdom rather than acknowledging the fundamental discomfort of our condition as creatures capable of imagining infinite futures, but able to experience only one. Yet the shadow lives theory persists in our collective imagination despite having no empirical support and no logical necessity, suggesting that it resonates with something deeper than mere speculation, something closer to a fundamental truth about human consciousness and our relationship to possibility, choice, and the nature of identity itself across the terrain of potential worlds. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of shadow lives is that we occasionally glimpse them in moments of profound coincidence or déjà vu, in the uncanny sensation of having lived a moment before, or in the eerie familiarity of a stranger's face, as though we are catching fragmentary impressions of our parallel selves bleeding through the membrane between worlds, momentary intersections where our divergent timelines briefly align and create the uncanny feeling that we are not entirely alone in our choices. That somewhere in the vast architecture of reality, our other selves are making their own irreversible decisions, and we are somehow aware of it. Consider for a moment the sheer improbability of your existence in this universe, the precise alignment of physical constants that allowed for the emergence of consciousness itself, and the remarkable fact that you are here, now, observing this very cosmos with your own awareness and perception. The Anthropic Principle suggests that the universe we observe must be compatible with conscious and sapient life, for the simple and undeniable reason that we are here observing it, and our very presence as conscious observers constrains what kind of universe we could possibly find ourselves inhabiting. This principle comes in two formulations: the weak Anthropic Principle, which merely states that what we observe must be consistent with our existence as observers in this particular location and time, and the stronger version, which proposes that the universe itself must have properties that allow life to develop within it at some stage. The mechanism underlying this principle operates on a level of logical tautology, a self-evident truth that appears almost trivially obvious once articulated, yet carries profound implications for how we understand cosmic selection and probability. We exist, therefore the laws of physics and the initial conditions of the universe must be such that existence is possible. We observe a universe fine-tuned for carbon-based life, but this observation tells us nothing about whether the universe was designed to produce us or whether we simply could not possibly observe any other kind of universe. The Anthropic Principle becomes particularly intriguing when we consider the multiverse hypothesis, the idea that countless parallel universes might exist with varying physical laws and constants, and we naturally find ourselves in one of the rare universes where conditions permitted observers to arise. What persists despite the logical circularity of this reasoning is our continued puzzlement about apparent fine-tuning, the seeming miraculous precision of physical constants that allow for complexity in consciousness. Yet we have normalized the explanation that selection bias accounts for our observations without requiring cosmic intentionality or design. Yet this resolution, while logically satisfying, leaves us with a curious inversion. We have explained away the appearance of design without fully accounting for why our universe permits the very observers capable of asking these questions, suggesting that the Anthropic Principle may ultimately reveal less about cosmic architecture and more about the inherent limits of what conscious beings can know about their own existence. Perhaps the most humbling aspect of the Anthropic Principle is recognizing that it fundamentally prevents us from ever stepping outside ourselves to view reality from a truly objective vantage point. We are forever trapped within the circle of our own existence, able only to observe a universe already filtered through the lens of our capacity to exist within it, making the principle less an explanation of cosmic purpose and more a mirror reflecting the unavoidable epistemic boundaries of conscious observation itself. In this light, every scientific question we ask carries within it an implicit assumption about our right to ask it. We investigate the laws of nature secure in the knowledge that those laws permitted investigators to evolve. Yet this very security blinds us to alternative frameworks of understanding that might exist in universes where conscious reflection itself took radically different forms. The Anthropic Principle thus stands as both our greatest tool for understanding reality and our most inescapable prison. Within this prison, however, we find unexpected freedom. The very constraints that bind our perception also grant us the unique vantage point to recognize our own boundedness, to marvel at the mathematical elegance underlying existence, and to ask whether consciousness itself, capable of contemplating its own improbability, represents not a cosmic accident but the universe's way of achieving self-awareness. Consider the peculiar experience of existing simultaneously in multiple states of awareness, where your conscious mind inhabits one reality while another aspect of your being operates in an entirely different context, completely severed from the thoughts and sensations of your primary self. Imagine sitting in a meeting, your body present, and your voice responding appropriately to questions posed by colleagues, yet your consciousness drifting through a vivid memory of a conversation you had years ago, or perhaps anticipating an evening plans with such intensity that it feels as though you are already there, living that future moment with complete sensory detail and emotional engagement. During these instances, you are not simply daydreaming in the casual sense. Rather, you exist in a fragmented state where your awareness has genuinely bifurcated, creating two separate streams of consciousness that operate without knowledge of one another, each one feeling utterly real and present in its own domain. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves the brain's remarkable capacity for compartmentalization and the way attention can be dynamically allocated across multiple neural networks simultaneously. Your prefrontal cortex manages the external performance, the necessary social responses and physical adjustments required for your immediate environment, while deeper limbic structures and memory centers activate alternative narratives, other possible versions of your life unfolding in parallel to your ostensible reality. These parallel consciousnesses do not interfere with one another because they occupy different neural substrates and different timescales. One is anchored in present-moment sensory input, while the other exists in the realm of memory, anticipation, or imagination. What makes this phenomenon particularly enigmatic is how thoroughly we have normalized its occurrence without ever truly examining its metaphysical implications. We dismiss these parallel states as mere distraction or absent-mindedness, treating them as minor glitches in attention rather than recognizing them as evidence that consciousness itself may be far more divisible, distributed, and multiplicitous than our waking philosophy typically allows. The fact that you can simultaneously exist in two different experiential realities, that your sense of self can be bifurcated without creating obvious internal conflict or paradox, suggests something profound about the nature of identity itself, and whether what we call the unified self is perhaps a comforting illusion maintained by the brain's narrative centers. Perhaps this is why we experience such disorientation when suddenly pulled from one consciousness stream into another. When a colleague's voice breaks through your reverie, and you must rapidly reintegrate your fragmented awareness back into a semblance of unified selfhood, a jarring reminder that the coherent I we assume to be continuous is actually a delicate construction that the brain perpetually reassembles from disparate, often contradictory states of consciousness. And yet, each time you successfully reintegrate these fragmented streams, you strengthen the illusion of continuity, training your brain to weave competing narratives into a single coherent thread. A process so seamless that you rarely notice the thousands of micro-moments each day when you are not truly unified, but rather a parliament of simultaneous consciousnesses voting on which version of you gets to be real. Consider the artist who loses hours to creative flow while their conscious mind worries about unpaid bills, or the parent whose body comforts a crying child while their awareness simultaneously processes a work crisis. Each moment a demonstration that we are not singular beings pretending to be multiple, but rather multiple consciousnesses pretending, through sheer neurological habit, to be one. Consider the experience of existing as a fragmented consciousness moving through time, where you are simultaneously many versions of yourself across different moments, different choices, and different circumstances, yet somehow aware of a unified presence that observes all these parallel iterations from a vantage point beyond linear experience. This is the concept known as the oversoul, a notion that suggests beneath the surface of individual consciousness exists a greater singular entity that encompasses all versions of ourselves that have ever existed or will ever exist, a sort of meta-consciousness that transcends the boundaries of separate incarnations and parallel lives. When you find yourself making a decision and simultaneously feeling the weight of roads not taken, when you experience the uncanny sense that you are being guided by an intuition that seems to know the outcomes of futures you have not yet lived, or when you encounter a moment of synchronicity so precise that it feels orchestrated by something beyond mere coincidence, you might be catching a glimpse of this oversoul at work. A higher aspect of your being that exists outside of time and space as ordinarily conceived. The psychological mechanism underlying this experience appears to involve the brain's remarkable ability to process information at levels beneath conscious awareness, to recognize patterns that span across years and different contexts, and to generate a sense of meaning that connects disparate events into a coherent narrative of purpose. What makes this concept persist in human consciousness, despite the absence of empirical verification, is perhaps our deep need to believe that there exists something continuous within us that transcends the fragmentation of everyday existence, something that ensures our individual struggles and decisions matter within a larger framework of meaning. The Oversoul appeals to a fundamental human yearning for unity within multiplicity, for the assurance that even as we experience ourselves as separate and isolated, we are never truly disconnected from a greater whole that holds all our possible selves in perfect simultaneous awareness. and this belief has become so woven into spiritual traditions across cultures that we rarely question whether we are discovering something real or creating something necessary for our psychological survival. Perhaps the Oversoul's most compelling evidence lies not in mystical revelation, but in those moments when a forgotten memory surfaces exactly when you need it, when you suddenly understand why a past failure was necessary, or when you recognize that the person you are becoming was always implicit in the person you were, suggesting that some part of you has always known the full arc of your becoming. In this way, the Oversoul might be less a mystical entity to be discovered than a natural consequence of consciousness itself, a unified field of awareness that emerges when we stop treating our scattered moments as disconnected events and instead recognize them as expressions of a single, coherent self moving through time with far greater wisdom than its individual components can perceive. The Oversoul, in this understanding, becomes less about external salvation and more about the gradual recognition that the intelligence guiding your life has always been you, or rather, a version of you that exists in the wholeness beyond the artificial boundaries of sequential time, patiently waiting for your conscious mind to catch up to what it has always known. And perhaps this is why the most transformative moments in life often come not as surprises, but as recognitions. Sudden clarifications that what you are experiencing now was always going to find you, that the Oversoul's patient intelligence has been orchestrating a curriculum of becoming that your conscious self is only now beginning to comprehend, making the journey from fragmentation to wholeness not a reaching toward something external, but a remembering of something that was never actually lost.